Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we're not stepping into the polished world of Hollywood. We're walking into a small, smoke-stained bar in Canarsie, Brooklyn, a place the movies made look glamorous, but in reality was something far more dangerous. The Bamboo Lounge. In Goodfellas, it felt like a wise guy hangout. Red lights, laughter, drinks flowing. But the real Bamboo Lounge wasn't a social club. It was a headquarters, a command center for hijackings, a meeting place for loan sharks and fences, a room where debts were settled, and sometimes bones were broken. This is where careers were made in the American Mafia, and sometimes ended. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? We love seeing this underworld stretch across countries and time zones. And if you enjoy long-form crime documentaries that go beyond the movie myths, that uncover what really happened behind the scenes, make sure you subscribe to Outlaw Icons and turn on notifications so you never miss a descent into the shadows. Now, take a slow breath. Let the noise of the day fade. Picture a dim Brooklyn bar in the late 1960s. A back table, a whispered conversation, a truck full of cargo about to disappear. And understand this. The Bamboo Lounge wasn't where gangsters relaxed. It was where they worked. This is Outlaw Icons. And tonight, we step inside the real headquarters of the hijacking empire. Chapter 1. The movie myth. The Bamboo Lounge in Goodfellas. The door slams. A glass shatters. Someone is dragged across a sticky floor, his shoes leaving thin streaks through spilled beer and cigarette ash. Outside, a truck idles in the cold Brooklyn night, its engine humming like a patient animal waiting to be fed. Inside, no one rushes to help. No one even looks surprised. Orders have already been given. A future has already been decided. And yet, if you've only seen the movies, you'd never imagine it happening here. In Goodfellas, the Bamboo Lounge glows red and gold. The lighting is warm, almost flattering. Laughter spills from the tables. Drinks arrive without being ordered. Men in tailored suits lean back in their chairs like kings surveying their kingdom. It feels like a place where wise guys unwind. A clubhouse, a brotherhood, a reward for loyalty. The camera moves slowly through the room, as if the place itself is alive and breathing. It feels intimate, controlled, comfortable. It feels safe. But the real Bamboo Lounge was not safe. It was not warm. It was not cinematic. It stood in Canarsie, Brooklyn, far from Manhattan's sparkle and far from the polished illusions of Hollywood. The streets around it were lined with modest homes, auto shops, warehouses, and the quiet routines of working-class families who had no idea that just beyond one unassuming door, a different economy was operating. An underground system, cold and precise. The real Bamboo Lounge did not glow red. It flickered. The neon outside buzzed. The interior lighting was uneven, harsh in some corners, dim in others. Cigarette smoke hung in the air like a permanent fog. The floor was worn. The bar was scarred from years of glasses slammed down too hard. It wasn't designed to impress. It was designed to function. Because this wasn't a hangout. It was a headquarters. Inside those walls, hijackings were mapped out like business plans. Routes were studied. Schedules memorized. Truck drivers identified. A hijacking, for those who imagine it as a chaotic stick-up, was rarely spontaneous. It was more like fishing with a net cast at exactly the right moment. You didn't chase every truck. You waited for the right one. The one carrying electronics, or liquor, or high-end clothing. You learned when it left, where it slowed down, who was behind the wheel. And that knowledge often passed across a small table inside the Bamboo Lounge. In the film, men toast each other. They clap shoulders. They laugh. In reality, men leaned in close and spoke quietly. They understood the stakes. A single mistake could mean prison, or worse. A stolen shipment gone wrong could ripple outward like a cracked windshield, shattering alliances and drawing federal heat. So, conversations were tight. Controlled. Every word weighed before it was spoken. The Bamboo Lounge was not a place to relax. It was a place to work. Men walked in with ambition burning behind their eyes. Some were young, eager, desperate to prove themselves. They wanted a seat at the table. They wanted to be trusted with something bigger than street-level hustling. A hijacking was a promotion, a chance to show you could handle pressure, that you wouldn't panic when the truck's headlights cut through the dark, that you wouldn't talk when the questions came. Careers were made in rooms like this, and careers were ended there too. Loan sharking operations ran out of the same bar where beers were poured. A loan wasn't just money handed across the table. It was a leash. Interest accumulated quietly, like snow piling up overnight. Miss a payment, and the snow turned to ice. Slippery. Dangerous. Men who once walked in confidently would return days later, shoulders lower, eyes darting. Pride stripped away one installment at a time. The movies show camaraderie. They show loyalty sealed with laughter. The real loyalty here was enforced. If someone skimmed from a hijacked load, it didn't end in a stern conversation. It ended in discipline, sometimes swift, sometimes public enough to send a message without leaving permanent damage. Other times, far more permanent. The Bamboo Lounge functioned like a courtroom without a judge. Decisions were delivered, not debated, and above all of it was structure. The film makes it feel loose, almost casual, like a group of friends drifting in and out of crime. But the real operation was layered. There were captains. There were soldiers. There were associates trying to climb, and everyone knew where they stood. The Bamboo Lounge was part of a territory, and territory meant control. You didn't operate in that neighborhood without permission. The bar was not independent. It was an extension of something larger, something older, something that valued silence more than spectacle. Hollywood painted the Bamboo Lounge as a symbol of arrival. In reality, it was a filter. If you couldn't handle what happened inside, you didn't last. The men who sat at those tables were not caricatures. They had mortgages, wives, children. Some carried quiet regrets that only surfaced late at night. Others felt pride, a twisted satisfaction in outsmarting corporations and insurers. They told themselves they weren't hurting anyone directly. The cargo was insured. The companies were huge. No one would miss a few crates. But that rationalization didn't quiet the fear. Because fear was always there. It lived in the corner booth. It sat beside the jukebox. It followed men into the bathroom mirror when they splashed water on their faces after a tense meeting. The fear of surveillance. The fear of betrayal. The fear that the man you were laughing with tonight might testify tomorrow. The Bamboo Lounge was not a party. It was a pressure chamber. In Goodfellas, the bar feels almost glamorous, like a backstage pass to a forbidden world. The audience is invited to enjoy the ride. The camera lingers lovingly on the details. But the real details were harsher. The smell of sweat under cheap cologne. The sound of fists connecting with ribs in the back room. The way a man's voice trembled slightly when he swore he'd make good on what he owed. These were not moments for sweeping orchestral scores. They were sharp, uncomfortable, human. The Bamboo Lounge did not elevate men. It tested them, and the testing never stopped. Every truck hijacked successfully built confidence. Every loan collected reinforced authority. Every associate who proved reliable moved one step closer to the inner circle. But with every success came attention. And attention, in that world, was poison. The more money flowed through those walls, the more eyes turned toward them. Law enforcement didn't see red lighting and friendly smiles. They saw patterns, reports, repeated thefts along certain routes. Consistency. Consistency leaves footprints. Inside the Bamboo Lounge, those footprints were discussed in whispers. Adjustments were made. Routes changed. People reassigned. It was a chessboard disguised as a bar. Pieces moved constantly. Pawns advanced. Knights circled. And somewhere in the background, larger players observed without being seen. The movie shows wise guys raising glasses. The real Bamboo Lounge raised questions. Who was trustworthy? Who was slipping? Who was drawing heat? Conversations sometimes ended mid-sentence when the door opened. Not because strangers were entering, but because even familiar faces could no longer be fully trusted. Paranoia seeped into the walls. It mixed with the smoke and settled into the wood. And yet, men kept coming back. Because for many of them, there was nowhere else to go. Legitimate work paid slowly. Respect came slower. Inside the Bamboo Lounge, advancement was visible. Immediate. Risky, yes, but tangible. You could walk in as a nobody and leave with a job that changed your life. One successful hijacking could pay more than months of honest labor. That promise was intoxicating. The film captures that intoxication, but it softens the edges. It trims away the parts that keep you awake at night. It turns danger into spectacle. The truth was colder. The Bamboo Lounge was a machine. Every man inside was a gear. Some small, some large, but all replaceable. The machine did not care about ego. It cared about results. Deliver the truck. Collect the debt. Keep your mouth shut. And if you couldn't, the door that once welcomed you could close just as quickly. The contrast is not subtle. Hollywood needed charm. The real Bamboo Lounge operated on calculation. The film offered nostalgia for a lost era. The real era offered no such comfort. Behind that unassuming storefront in Canarsie, decisions were made that would ripple outward for years. Alliances formed there. Enemies marked. Young men drawn deeper into a life they only half understood. And as the money flowed and the operations expanded, the room grew heavier. Because success attracts storms. And somewhere beyond the laughter, beyond the whispered plans and clinking glasses, something was building. Something that would test the loyalty of every man who ever pulled up a chair inside that bar. The movies ended the scene with music. Reality was about to end it with consequences. Chapter 2. Where it actually was, Canarsie, Brooklyn. The truck turns off the Belt Parkway just before dawn, tires humming against cracked asphalt as the sky over Brooklyn begins to pale. It doesn't look like the beginning of a crime. It looks like the beginning of a workday. Streetlights flicker out one by one. A man in a bathrobe shuffles to his mailbox. Somewhere nearby, a radio hums with morning news. Ordinary. Predictable. Safe. But that's exactly why it worked. Canarsie, Brooklyn was never meant to be cinematic. It didn't have the romantic grit of Little Italy or the theatrical swagger of Manhattan nightlife. It was flat streets and modest houses. Vinyl siding. Front lawns trimmed, just enough to keep up appearances. Auto shops with faded signs. Warehouses near the water. The kind of neighborhood where neighbors knew each other's routines and kids rode bikes until the streetlights blinked on. And that normalcy was its greatest weapon. The real Bamboo Lounge wasn't tucked into a tourist corridor or surrounded by flashing neon. It sat quietly along Rockaway Parkway, in a part of Brooklyn that blended into itself. You could drive past it a dozen times and never realize what it was. The exterior didn't scream power. It whispered survival. That was deliberate. Crime, at its highest levels, does not hide in shadows alone. It hides in plain sight. Canarsie in the 1960s and 70s was blue-collar to its core. Longshoremen, truck drivers, construction workers, men who left before sunrise and came home with grease under their fingernails. Women who balanced grocery budgets down to the dollar. It was a neighborhood built on routine, and routine makes anomalies easier to spot. So the Bamboo Lounge became part of that routine. Men walked in after work. They played cards. They drank. They talked sports. From the outside, nothing looked unusual. But inside, conversations drifted far beyond baseball scores and boxing matches. Canarsie was strategically placed, close enough to major trucking routes, close enough to the arteries that fed into John F. Kennedy Airport's cargo terminals, close enough to warehouses where stolen goods could disappear into legitimate supply, chains like ink dropped into water. Location, in crime, is like oxygen. Without it, nothing survives. From Canarsie, a hijacked truck could be rerouted in minutes. Cargo could be unloaded in garages or storage spaces that looked no different from any other. A shipment of electronics could move from airport runway to street corner without ever appearing suspicious to anyone outside the network. And the Bamboo Lounge sat right in the center of that web. To understand its importance, you have to understand territory. Organized crime wasn't chaos. It was mapped, divided, controlled. Every block in Brooklyn fell under someone's influence. Every bar, every social club, every back room had a chain of authority stretching upward like the roots of a tree buried beneath concrete. Canarsie belonged to a specific power structure. You didn't open a bar there without understanding who ultimately allowed it. You didn't run operations without answering to someone higher. The Bamboo Lounge functioned within that hierarchy. It was not a rogue outpost. It was an approved node in a larger system. And that system valued discretion above all. Unlike the neighborhoods romanticized in films, Canarsie did not advertise its secrets. It didn't need to. The power here was quieter, less theatrical. Men who controlled the area didn't parade through streets demanding attention. They operated through reputation, through consistency, through the quiet understanding that certain lines were never crossed. You could feel it walking down those streets. A subtle tension beneath the ordinary rhythm, like a low-frequency hum you can't quite hear but can somehow sense in your chest. For the young men drawn into the Bamboo Lounge orbit, Canarsie represented opportunity wrapped in familiarity. They weren't commuting into Manhattan skyscrapers. They weren't navigating flashy casinos. They were operating in their own backyard, the streets they'd grown up on, the blocks where their mothers still shop for groceries. That familiarity lowered defenses. A hijacking wasn't discussed in a smoky penthouse overlooking the city. It was discussed 2 miles from where someone's grandmother lived. That proximity made it feel manageable, less like organized crime and more like neighborhood hustle scaled up. But scale changes everything. Canarsie's proximity to the Belt Parkway meant access to movement. Trucks could merge into traffic seamlessly. A stolen trailer could blend into dozens of identical rigs hauling legitimate goods. It was camouflaged through volume. If you're a single fish in a vast ocean, predators have trouble finding you. The Bamboo Lounge relied on that principle. Inside, maps weren't pinned to corkboards like in a detective drama. Routes were memorized. Drivers were studied. Patterns were discussed casually over drinks. You didn't need elaborate blueprints when the men involved knew every intersection by heart. Canarsie's geography became part of the operation's muscle memory. Turn left here. Slow down there. Avoid that stretch after midnight, because patrol cars sometimes linger. It was knowledge passed down through experience, not textbooks, and the neighborhood itself shielded it. Residents saw men coming and going, but bars in Brooklyn were social anchors. No one questioned why a handful of regulars spent long hours inside. No one found it strange that certain cars appeared more frequently than others. It was Brooklyn. It was life. Meanwhile, goods were flowing. A truck hijacked near the airport might find its cargo redistributed before sunrise. Televisions, clothing, liquor, each item moving like currency through invisible channels. The Bamboo Lounge wasn't the warehouse. It wasn't the physical storage site. It was the brain. Think of it like a switchboard operator in the old days. Cables plugged in and out, connecting calls across distances. The lounge connected information. It directed movement. It aligned timing. Without it, operations would have felt scattered. With it, they felt orchestrated. And orchestration requires control. That control came from understanding territory intimately. Canarsie wasn't flashy, but it was loyal. Many families had lived there for years. Generations overlapped. Loyalty in such neighborhoods can be both shield and sword. If someone outside the area caused trouble, word spread quickly. Outsiders stood out. Familiar faces didn't. The Bamboo Lounge thrived because it was familiar. Its neon sign didn't demand admiration. It flickered like countless other bars across Brooklyn. The front door didn't intimidate. It invited. But once inside, the tone shifted subtly. Regulars occupied predictable seats. Conversations lowered when necessary. Newcomers were observed before being acknowledged. It wasn't paranoia. It was procedure. In movies, we see the charm of mob-control neighborhoods. The sense of community intertwined with power. But Canarsie's reality was more subdued. The men who controlled the Bamboo Lounge didn't need to perform authority publicly. They exercised it privately. That quiet authority extended to conflict resolution. If disputes arose between truckers or drivers connected to the area, they often found their way to the same back tables where hijackings were planned. Decisions made there carried weight because they were backed by territory. Territory means enforcement, and enforcement didn't require spectacle. The mere knowledge that someone could call on muscle was enough. The Bamboo Lounge operated like a lighthouse that never turned off its beam. Always present, always steady. For young associates, stepping into that environment felt like crossing into adulthood. This wasn't street corner bravado anymore. This was structure. This was proximity to real power. And yet, the illusion of safety remained. Canarsie wasn't Midtown Manhattan. Federal agents didn't swarm its sidewalks daily. It was removed enough from central glare to allow breathing room. That breathing room created confidence. Confidence created expansion. More hijackings, more loans, more revenue. But geography cuts both ways. The same highways that allowed stolen goods to move quickly also allowed law enforcement to trace patterns. The same consistency that made operations smooth left statistical footprints. Repetition, over time, forms shapes, and shapes attract scrutiny. Inside the Bamboo Lounge, conversations began shifting as the years progressed. Not because the neighborhood changed dramatically, but because scale had changed the risk profile. More money means more attention. More attention means pressure. And pressure exposes fault lines. Still, Canarsie held. Its unremarkable exterior continued shielding the extraordinary decisions happening inside. Neighbors mowed lawns. Kids played stickball. Mothers called children in for dinner. And behind one modest storefront, the machinery of hijacking continued turning. The contrast between perception and reality remained stark. If you filmed Rockaway Parkway in broad daylight, you'd capture calm streets and everyday life. Nothing about it screamed criminal empire. That's precisely why it worked. The power wasn't in spectacle. It was in invisibility. In Goodfellas, locations feel curated for drama. Lighting, camera angles, music, everything heightens tension. But the real Canarsie needed none of that. Its tension was ambient, subtle. It existed not in how the place looked, but in what it facilitated. The Bamboo Lounge was not a palace. It was a nerve center disguised as a neighborhood bar. And as the operations grew more ambitious, as larger scores were whispered about and greater risks contemplated, the weight of what Canarsie was supporting began to intensify. Because the more efficient the machine became, the more fragile its balance grew. And somewhere beyond those quiet Brooklyn streets, beyond the flickering neon and the low murmur of afterwork conversations, something larger was forming, a plan that would stretch the limits of what this neighborhood headquarters could sustain. The geography that once protected them would soon be tested, and when that test came, Canarsie would no longer feel so invisible. Chapter 3. The owner, Sonny Bamboo, Angelo McConaughey. The first time a federal agent tried to explain the Bamboo Lounge to a jury, he described it as a front, a shell, a place designed to look harmless while concealing something darker beneath. He used charts, timelines. He pointed to ownership records and liquor licenses. He spoke in clean, organized sentences. But charts don't show personality, and ownership papers don't show presence. Because when you step through the front door of the Bamboo Lounge in Canarsie, the first thing you noticed wasn't a criminal conspiracy. It was him. He wasn't the loudest man in the room. He didn't have to be. He stood behind the bar or near it, moving in a rhythm that felt effortless, pouring drinks, nodding at regulars, greeting newcomers with a look that weighed them before he ever opened his mouth. His name was Angelo McConaughey, though most people knew him by the nickname that became fused to the bar itself. Sonny Bamboo. The name sounded almost playful, harmless, something you might hear in a neighborhood story about a colorful character who owned a local spot for decades. But nothing about Sonny's position was accidental. Owning a place like the Bamboo Lounge in that part of Brooklyn meant understanding the rules long before you signed a lease. It meant knowing who had influence in Canarsie, who had to be respected, who had to be consulted. A bar doesn't simply open in a territory shaped by organized crime. It is permitted to exist. And Sonny understood permission. He wasn't portrayed as a mastermind in movies. In fact, he barely appeared in them at all. The cinematic version of the Bamboo Lounge glides past ownership like it's incidental, as if bars simply materialize wherever wise guys need a place to gather. But in reality, ownership is leverage. The man who holds the keys controls access. Sonny Bamboo wasn't flashy. He didn't project the kind of dominance that draws a spotlight. His power was quieter, like a doorman at an exclusive club who never raises his voice but decides who steps inside. He maintained the space. He maintained the rhythm. And he maintained the illusion that this was simply a neighborhood bar, which made him indispensable. He knew when to keep conversations at the front loud enough to drown out whispers in the back. He knew which regulars were harmless and which ones were climbing. He understood that the Bamboo Lounge wasn't just a social club. It was a stage set for something far more structured. Think of him as the conductor of an orchestra where half the instruments were invisible. Behind the bar, he listened. Listening was currency. Men who came through those doors often underestimated the man pouring their drinks. They assumed ownership meant service, hospitality. But Sonny was gathering information the way a banker gathers deposits. Who was arguing? Who was celebrating? Who looked nervous? Who lingered too long at certain tables? Information in that world was oxygen. Sonny's role wasn't to plan hijackings personally. It wasn't to enforce loans or negotiate territory. It was to create the environment where those things could happen without friction, without suspicion, without chaos. He kept the engine lubricated. The Bamboo Lounge could not function as a criminal headquarters without someone making it feel ordinary. And ordinary was Sonny's masterpiece. He knew when to close early. He knew when to keep it open. He understood that timing could protect or expose. If a meeting ran late, he ensured the front door didn't draw attention. If tempers flared in the back room, he controlled the sound level at the bar. There's a difference between being in charge and being in position. Sonny's genius was positional. He stood at the threshold of everything, not at the top of the hierarchy, but directly at the entry point. And in organized crime, proximity to entry points is power. Young associates who dreamed of advancement often began their climb by proving themselves in that room. They'd sit near the bar, hoping to be noticed, hoping to be trusted with errands, with small responsibilities. Sonny saw that hunger up close. Some of them reminded him of himself, because Sonny hadn't always been an owner. He'd grown up in the same kind of Brooklyn blocks that produced truck drivers, mechanics, and hustlers. He understood ambition. He understood the draw of easy money compared to the grind of legitimate work. But owning the Bamboo Lounge meant walking a tightrope. On one side was loyalty to the men who controlled the territory. On the other side was legal exposure. Liquor licenses could be revoked. Health inspections could become weapons. A bar owner tied too closely to crime risked losing everything if heat intensified. So Sonny mastered balance. He didn't speak openly about business. He didn't brag. He didn't make himself the center of stories. He was the constant backdrop, the steady presence. And that steadiness allowed more volatile personalities to operate around him. In Goodfellas, the Bamboo Lounge is bathed in cinematic glow. It feels like a playground for mobsters. But in real life, Sonny managed tension like a thermostat. If energy spiked too high, he cooled it. If a meeting required privacy, he orchestrated distraction. There were nights when the back room grew heavy with silence. Decisions were being made. Futures recalculated. Sonny would wipe down the bar slowly, pretending not to notice. But he always noticed. And sometimes he worried, because being owner meant being anchored. If the Bamboo Lounge attracted too much attention, his name would be on the paperwork. His address would be in reports. His business would be photographed. He wasn't naive. He understood the risks. But he also understood the rewards. A bar like the Bamboo Lounge generated revenue beyond drink sales. It generated relevance. It positioned Sonny as a trusted figure within a powerful network. That trust was both shield and chain. He could not easily walk away. Imagine running a legitimate storefront while knowing that behind its walls, crimes were being planned that could trigger federal investigations. Imagine smiling at customers while understanding that any one of them could be an informant. That was Sonny's daily reality. And yet, he kept showing up. Because loyalty in that world wasn't just about fear. It was about identity. The Bamboo Lounge became an extension of him. The nickname stuck not only because of the bar's name, but because he embodied it. Calm exterior, tough fiber beneath. There were moments though, when the illusion cracked. A scuffle spilling too close to the front door. A dead enforcement session that left someone limping into the night. A rumor about surveillance in the area. Sonny would feel the shift in atmosphere immediately. The air changed. Conversations shortened. He would adjust. Maybe dim the lights slightly. Maybe increase the volume of the jukebox. Maybe close early under the excuse of maintenance. Subtle moves. But subtle moves keep empires quiet. Hollywood rarely captures that kind of management. It prefers spectacle. It prefers loud declarations and dramatic confrontations. Sonny's reality was paperwork, deliveries, repairs, timing, human temperature control. And through it all, he remained loyal to the structure above him. The Bamboo Lounge operated within a larger framework controlled by men with greater authority. Sonny didn't challenge that hierarchy. He respected it. His job was to maintain the ground floor, the roots. And roots are rarely glamorous. But without roots, nothing stands. Young men who later became deeply embedded in hijacking operations passed through his doorway countless times. Some walked in brimming with confidence. Others returned shaken after close calls. Sonny saw the emotional spectrum. He saw pride. He saw fear. He saw regret flicker across faces when a deal went sideways. And he said very little. Because sometimes the most powerful thing an owner can do is absorb energy without amplifying it. The Bamboo Lounge's longevity depended on that absorption, on Sonny's ability to make extraordinary operations feel routine. He didn't chase headlines. He avoided attention. When outsiders asked questions, he leaned into the narrative of simple bar owner. Drinks, cards, regulars. It wasn't entirely false. The Bamboo Lounge did function as a neighborhood spot. That duality was its genius. By day or early evening, it looked indistinguishable from dozens of other Brooklyn bars. But after certain hours, certain tables became strategic positions. And Sonny stood between those two realities like a bridge. He wasn't the architect of every crime discussed there, but he was the gatekeeper of the room where they were discussed. That matters. Ownership is not about masterminding every act. It is about enabling space, protecting environment, ensuring continuity. As hijackings grew more ambitious and the stakes climbed higher, the Bamboo Lounge's significance intensified. With that intensity came pressure. Sonny felt it, in the way certain conversations turned sharper, in the way more unfamiliar faces appeared, in the way discussions about bigger opportunities replaced smaller hustles. He knew escalation when he saw it, and escalation carries consequence. The more the lounge became associated with serious operations, the more it risked crossing from invisible to exposed. Sonny could not control every trajectory, but he could manage atmosphere. And for years, he did. The myth suggests the Bamboo Lounge was a glamorous clubhouse where mobsters relaxed between scores. The truth is far more complex. It was a workplace disguised as leisure. And at the center of that disguise stood Sonny Bamboo, not as a kingpin, not as a soldier, but as something arguably more critical. The custodian of the illusion. And illusions, when stretched too far, eventually tear. As the ambitions inside those walls expanded and whispers of unprecedented scores began circulating, Sonny would find himself balancing more than drinks and doors. He would be balancing survival. Because when the storm finally reached Canarsie, it wouldn't distinguish between planner and proprietor. And the man who held the keys would have nowhere to hide. Chapter 4. Paul Vario's territory and control. The decision wasn't made inside the Bamboo Lounge. It was made somewhere else, in a quieter room, by a man who rarely needed to raise his voice. But the ripple from that decision reached Canarsie within hours. A truck driver who had been skimming from loads suddenly found himself summoned. A collector who had grown careless was told to step aside. The air inside the Bamboo Lounge shifted, almost imperceptibly, because everyone understood one thing. The territory had spoken. In movies, power is loud. It's delivered with dramatic monologues and sudden violence. It walks into a room and commands attention. But in real life, especially in Brooklyn during those years, power often looked like absence. It looked like a man who didn't need to be in the room to control it. That man was Paul Vario. He didn't own the Bamboo Lounge. His name wasn't on the liquor license. He wasn't the one wiping down the bar at closing time. But the lounge operated inside his territory, and territory meant everything. To understand his control, you have to picture Brooklyn not as a borough, but as a chessboard. Each square claimed. Each square defended. It wasn't chaos. It was structure layered on structure. Crews operated under captains. Captains answered upward. And at each level, authority was enforced not just by muscle, but by reputation. Vario's reputation in that part of Brooklyn carried weight. He wasn't flashy. He didn't cultivate celebrity. He cultivated consistency. Men who worked under him knew what was expected. You earned. You respected hierarchy. You didn't attract unnecessary attention. And above all, you understood that nothing significant happened in his area without his knowledge. The Bamboo Lounge sat firmly inside that area. That meant every hijacking discussed there, every loan arranged, every enforcement action taken, ultimately existed under Vario's umbrella. He didn't need to micromanage. He didn't need to sit in the back room of the bar every night. Control at that level is more like gravity than force. You don't see it, but you feel it constantly. Young associates who stepped into the lounge understood that stepping into Canarसी's underworld meant stepping into Vario's shadow. They might never speak directly to him, but his influence framed the room. Territory and organized crime is like oxygen in a closed space. You don't notice it until it's restricted. If someone from another crew attempted to operate in Canarsie without permission, the reaction would be swift. Not theatrical. Swift. A message delivered quietly. A warning issued. And if ignored, consequences. The Bamboo Lounge thrived because it respected that structure. Sonny Bamboo managed the bar. Associates coordinated hijackings. But Vario represented the ceiling, the invisible roof above it all. In Goodfellas, the power dynamic often feels fluid. Characters move between spaces with ease. But the real system was far more rigid. Boundaries mattered. Geography mattered. You didn't simply expand operations because you felt ambitious. Expansion required approval. Approval required trust. And trust had to be earned over years. Vario's control extended beyond physical territory. It extended into opportunity. Who got the green light on a hijacking? Who was trusted with information about valuable cargo shipments? Who was allowed to attend certain meetings inside the Bamboo Lounge's back room? These decisions weren't random. They flowed upward before they flowed down. Picture the Bamboo Lounge like a river delta. Streams of information and money converging. But upstream, there was a dam. And that dam had a name. Men who worked within his crew often described him as calm, calculating, rarely impulsive. That steadiness filtered down. The hijacking pipeline that ran through Canarsie required discipline. You couldn't afford reckless personalities when trucks worth hundreds of thousands of dollars were involved. You needed predictability. Vario valued predictability. He built a crew that reflected it. Inside the Bamboo Lounge, conversations often circle back to one unspoken understanding. Approval had already been granted. That knowledge allowed operations to move smoothly. Without it, the lounge would have been little more than a risky gathering spot. Control also meant protection. If law enforcement pressure increased, territory leaders assessed risk collectively. They shifted activity. They insulated key players. They absorbed certain losses to preserve larger structures. The Bamboo Lounge wasn't operating alone. It was part of a network that shared intelligence. When a hijacking succeeded, money didn't simply stay in the pockets of the men who carried it out. Portions traveled upward. That flow reinforced loyalty and hierarchy. It was taxation without paperwork. A percentage for permission. A percentage for protection. Some might see that as exploitation. Within that world, it was insurance. Because if something went wrong, the structure above you mattered. Imagine a young associate involved in his first significant hijacking. The adrenaline alone could distort judgment. But knowing you were operating under a powerful territory leader brought confidence. It meant you weren't improvising in chaos. You were part of an approved machine. That machine was careful. Vario wasn't reckless about drawing attention. He understood the long game. The more stable Canarsie appeared on the surface, the longer operations could continue beneath it. The Bamboo Lounge's quiet exterior aligned perfectly with his philosophy. There's a misconception that organized crime is built on constant violence. In reality, the most successful operations rely on minimizing it. Violence draws heat. Heat attracts federal attention. Attention threatens territory. So Vario maintained discipline. If enforcement was necessary, it was targeted, controlled, designed to correct behavior rather than create spectacle. Men who entered the Bamboo Lounge to discuss business knew they were stepping into a structured hierarchy. They could joke, they could drink, but beneath the surface, lines existed. Disrespect wasn't tolerated. Unapproved ventures weren't tolerated. Bringing unnecessary attention to the territory wasn't tolerated. That clarity prevented chaos. And chaos is expensive. In Goodfellas, scenes and mob hangouts often carry a tone of indulgence. But real territorial control imposed limits. You didn't gamble recklessly with reputation. You didn't treat hijackings like spontaneous adventures. They were coordinated under watchful eyes. The Bamboo Lounge was not independent. It was an extension of Vario's authority. Associates understood that crossing him meant isolation at best. At worst, something far more final. That knowledge didn't require constant reminders. It lived in reputation, in stories passed quietly between tables. The neighborhood itself respected that authority. Canarsie residents might not have articulated it openly, but they sensed boundaries. Certain disputes didn't escalate publicly because everyone knew there were other channels for resolution. The Bamboo Lounge became one of those channels. If two truckers had a disagreement over territory, it might be discussed there, but final say rested elsewhere. Power is not the loudest voice in the room. It is the voice that doesn't need to repeat itself. Vario's relationship to the Bamboo Lounge reflected that principle. He didn't posture. He didn't parade. He allowed the lounge to function as a node within his larger ecosystem. That ecosystem included hijacking crews, loan sharking operations, and connections to airport insiders who fed information about valuable shipments. Control over Canarsie meant control over access to opportunity. Young men who wanted to climb understood that the path ran through respect, through loyalty, through delivering results. The lounge became a proving ground. Deliver a successful hijacking, and your name carried more weight. Mishandle one, and doors closed. But behind that system was Vario's steady hand. He represented continuity. As years passed and federal scrutiny intensified across New York, territorial leaders like him adapted. They adjusted tactics. They emphasized discretion. They reminded crews that survival required subtlety. The Bamboo Lounge's unremarkable facade was not an accident. It was strategy aligned with territorial philosophy. Imagine the borough as a map dotted with lights. Some bright, some dim. The brightest ones attract attention. The dim ones last longer. Canarsie's light was intentionally muted. Vario ensured it stayed that way. That didn't mean risk disappeared. As operations expanded and ambitions grew, the scale of hijackings increased. Larger scores meant larger footprints. And footprints eventually lead back to territory. Control then becomes not just about enforcement, but about containment. When whispers began circulating about unprecedented opportunities, about scores larger than anything attempted before, territory leaders had to weigh risk carefully. Was the potential payout worth the potential exposure? Would success strengthen the crew, or would it invite scrutiny that threatened the entire structure? These questions didn't get debated loudly in the Bamboo Lounge. They traveled upward, and answers came back down. The men who operated within Canarsie understood that their actions reflected on the territory's leadership. Success elevated reputation. Failure embarrassed it. Reputation in that world was capital, and Paul Vario guarded that capital closely. His control over Canarsie wasn't theatrical. It wasn't romantic. It was administrative, strategic, rooted in decades of relationships and enforcement. The Bamboo Lounge existed because it fit within that framework. It served as a controlled environment where ambition could be harnessed rather than allowed to run wild. where information could be filtered rather than scattered. But control has limits. As the scale of operations grew and as the money flowing through those Brooklyn streets began reaching levels that were impossible to ignore, the pressure on territory intensified. Federal agencies didn't care about local hierarchies. They cared about patterns, about shipments disappearing, about revenue losses stacking up. And when those patterns began forming shapes too large to dismiss, control would face its greatest test. Because territory can shield only so much. And when the storm comes, it doesn't always stop at the border. Inside the Bamboo Lounge, the chairs were still filled. The drinks still poured. The laughter still rose at appropriate moments. But beneath that surface, tension was thickening. The man who rarely needed to raise his voice would soon need to navigate waters far rougher than street disputes. And when the largest gamble yet began to take shape, Canarsie would no longer be just another square on the chessboard. It would become the center of a storm that even territory could not fully contain. Chapter 5. Henry Hill's real base of operations. The phone rings just after midnight. A voice on the other end doesn't waste words. A truck has left the airport. Electronics. High value. Driver predictable. Route familiar. There's a window, but it's small. Move now, or don't move at all. He hangs up, doesn't rush, doesn't panic. He lights a cigarette first. The smoke steadies his breathing. Then he heads for Canarsie. If you've only seen the movies, you remember the swagger, the suits, the music, the smooth narration about how life felt untouchable. You remember the Bamboo Lounge glowing in red light, a playground for wise guys who seemed to glide through crime like it was choreography. But the real base of operations wasn't choreography. It was coordination. And for Henry Hill, the Bamboo Lounge wasn't a backdrop. It was an office. He wasn't a made man. That mattered. In that world, lineage and ceremony defined ceilings. But Hill had something else. Access. He moved between layers, between street-level muscle and higher-tier decision-makers. He was the connective tissue, and connective tissue is often more valuable than muscle. The Bamboo Lounge gave him a base. Not a glamorous one, not a cinematic one, a functional one. When Hill walked through that door, he wasn't coming to relax. He was coming to manage logistics, to check in, to receive updates, to distribute instructions. It was less like entering a nightclub and more like stepping into a dispatch center disguised as a bar. The hijacking pipeline required timing that bordered on obsessive. You couldn't simply know a truck was leaving JFK. You needed to know what it carried, who was driving, whether the driver had habits, whether he stopped for coffee, whether he panicked easily, whether he had family who might complicate matters if something went wrong. Information arrived in pieces. Some came from airport insiders who were paid quietly to leak cargo manifests. Some came from truck drivers who gambled too much and needed favors. Some came from longshoremen who noticed patterns in shipments. All of it flowed through the Bamboo Lounge. Hill would sit at a table near the back, drink barely touched, eyes always moving. He didn't command a room with volume. He worked through proximity, leaning in, listening, repeating instructions in low tones, like a man conducting a symphony where the instruments were engines and crowbars. In Goodfellas, the sense of invincibility dominates. The energy is euphoric. But in real life, Hill's nights were layered with anxiety. Every hijacking carried variables that couldn't be fully controlled. Weather, traffic, police patrol patterns, a driver who suddenly deviated from routine. The Bamboo Lounge became the place where contingency plans were discussed. If the truck accelerated instead of slowing, do this. If a patrol car lingered at the usual interception point, reroute here. If the cargo wasn't what you expected, unload fast and disappear. Imagine trying to choreograph a dance in the dark, where one misstep could land you in prison for decades. That was the reality behind the myth. Hill thrived in that environment. He enjoyed the adrenaline, the feeling of being central to something larger than himself. Growing up in Brooklyn, he'd always been close to power, but never fully inside it. The Bamboo Lounge narrowed that gap. It gave him visibility. It gave him responsibility. Responsibility in that world wasn't about titles. It was about trust. and trust was measured in results. When a hijacking succeeded, Hill's stock rose. When it faltered, scrutiny followed. He knew he was being evaluated constantly, by the men above him, by the men beside him, by the younger associates who watched him carefully, studying his posture, his tone, his reactions under pressure. The Bamboo Lounge was his proving ground, not because it was glamorous, because it was central. He used it as a clearinghouse. Stolen goods didn't physically sit at the bar, but the decisions about where they would land often started there. A shipment of electronics might be redirected to a warehouse connected to a fence in Queens. Clothing might be split and dispersed across smaller buyers to avoid attracting attention. Each decision required coordination. Hill wasn't simply ordering theft. He was managing redistribution. Think of it like rerouting a river after it's already flowing. Once a truck was intercepted, the clock started ticking. Goods had to move before reports were filed, before law enforcement began tracing. Inside the Bamboo Lounge, phones rang. Not openly in the center of the bar. In corners. In back rooms. Messages passed quickly. Names were rarely spoken in full. Addresses were implied rather than stated. Hill had to remember everything. He carried mental maps of routes and contacts, of who owed favors, of who had recently drawn attention and needed to lay low. The lounge gave him a physical anchor for those mental calculations. He didn't need to own the bar. He needed access to it, and he had it. When associates returned from a hijacking, adrenaline still spiking, they often stopped at the Bamboo Lounge first. Not to celebrate, to report, to decompress, to confirm next steps. Hill would listen carefully. Were there witnesses? Did the driver resist? Did anyone see faces clearly? Small details could become big problems later. Movies show laughter after a score. In reality, relief was muted. Relief didn't last long, because the next shipment was already being discussed. The lounge also functioned as a financial hub. Loan sharking operations intertwined with hijacking money. Cash from stolen goods could be loaned out at interest. Interest payments could finance further operations. It was circular, self-feeding. Hill participated in that cycle. He saw how money moved through hands like electricity through wires. He understood that hijacking wasn't just about quick profit. It was about sustaining a broader system. But that system had edges. Every associate he recruited, every driver he pressured, every insider he paid, introduced risk. And the more frequently he used the Bamboo Lounge as his coordination point, the more it became associated with him. That association was double-edged. It elevated him. It also exposed him. As the scale of hijackings increased, so did attention from law enforcement. Patterns began forming. Trucks from certain routes. Disappearances clustered in time frames. Hill felt that pressure. There were nights inside the Bamboo Lounge when conversation dipped lower than usual, when even the jukebox seemed too loud, when someone mentioned seeing unfamiliar cars parked across the street. Paranoia didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in gradually. Hill masked it with confidence. He had to. Associates looked to him for cues. If he appeared rattled, the entire operation risked unraveling. So he projected calm. But projection isn't immunity. He knew that being an associate meant he was more expendable than the men above him. If things went wrong, he could be sacrificed. That knowledge sat in his chest like a weight. The Bamboo Lounge offered him proximity to power. It also reminded him of his position. He wasn't untouchable, and yet he kept coming back. Because the draw of momentum was powerful. Each successful operation reinforced the narrative that he was essential, that he belonged in those backroom conversations, that he could navigate this world without being swallowed by it. Ambition can blur caution. Hill's role inside the Bamboo Lounge expanded over time. He wasn't just coordinating hijackings. He was building networks, strengthening relationships with fences, establishing reliability with insiders at the airport. The lounge became a spider's web, and Hill one of its most active threads. But webs catch flies. They also trap the spider if the web becomes too visible. As larger operations began circulating in whispers, as talk shifted from standard hijackings to something unprecedented in scale, Hill's base of operations would take on even greater significance. The Bamboo Lounge wasn't just facilitating routine theft anymore. It was incubating ambition. Ambition at that level carries consequences. Hill could sense the shift before it was spoken openly. Conversations about the big one didn't happen in loud tones. They happened in fragments. A comment here, a nod there, a meeting scheduled discreetly. He understood that if this larger plan materialized, the Bamboo Lounge would again serve as a coordination point. And that meant risk multiplying. Because small hijackings can slip beneath radar. Massive ones cannot. Inside the bar, glasses clinked. Cards shuffled. Cigarettes burned down to filters. From the outside, nothing looked unusual. But beneath that surface, calculations intensified. Hill stood the center of it. Not as a boss. Not as an owner. But as a bridge. And bridges carry weight. The myth suggests that the Bamboo Lounge was a stage for bravado. The reality is that it was a nerve center for logistics. And Henry Hill, for all his charisma and narrative flair later in life, spent countless hours there not celebrating, but calculating. As the night deepened and the phone rang again, signaling another opportunity, he rose from his seat. He had no way of knowing that the same base of operations that elevated him would eventually become a thread unraveling the entire tapestry. Because every headquarters, no matter how carefully managed, leaves traces. And traces, once followed, lead somewhere. Chapter 6. The Hijacking Pipeline. The headlights appear in the distance first. Two pale circles cutting through the dark stretch of road near the airport cargo terminals. The truck moves steady, heavy with weight. It doesn't yet realize it's about to lose. Inside the cab, the driver hums along to the radio. He thinks about his shift ending, about the coffee he'll grab before sunrise. He has no idea that 3 men are already waiting a mile ahead, engines running low, nerves humming even lower. The interception lasts less than 2 minutes. A car pulls in front. Another edges behind. The driver is boxed in like a piece on a chessboard with no squares left. A knock on the window. A weapon shown, not necessarily fired. A calm voice instructing him to step out. Hands raised. No screaming. No theatrics. Just efficiency. Then the truck changes direction. If the movies show hijackings as bursts of chaos and gunfire, the reality was closer to choreography. Controlled. Timed. Quiet. And behind that choreography was a system refined inside the Bamboo Lounge. The hijacking pipeline did not begin on the road. It began with information. Information was harvested like crops. Slowly. Patiently. Airport cargo terminals were fertile ground. Workers handling manifests knew what was coming in and out. Which shipments contain electronics? Which ones carried high-end clothing? Which ones were insured for sums large enough that companies would absorb losses without panic? A whisper inside the airport became a conversation in Brooklyn. Inside the Bamboo Lounge, tips were evaluated like investments. Not every truck was worth the risk. A hijacking is like pulling a thread from a sweater. If you pull the wrong one, the whole garment unravels. If you pull the right one, it slips free cleanly. The men around the back tables understood that balance. They discussed routes, timing, patrol patterns. You don't hijack during peak traffic. You don't hijack near well-lit intersections. You wait for the truck to slow naturally, near an exit ramp, near a stretch of road with minimal surveillance. The pipeline required layers. First, the tip. Second, verification. No one acted on rumor alone. Someone confirmed the shipment, confirmed the driver, confirmed the schedule. The Bamboo Lounge functioned as the verification hub. If a tip didn't survive scrutiny, it died there. If it survived, planning began. Roles were assigned. Drivers, blockers, offload crew, fences lined up in advance. A hijacking without a buyer is a liability. Stolen goods sitting in a garage attract attention. They needed to move quickly. Think of the pipeline like a bloodstream. Information enters at one end, adrenaline flows through the middle, and profit exits at the other. If any artery clogged, the whole body suffered. Inside the Bamboo Lounge, the arteries were constantly checked. Once the truck was taken, the next phase began immediately. The vehicle was rerouted to a prearranged location. Sometimes a warehouse connected to someone trusted. Sometimes a garage owned by a relative who asked no questions. The offload crew moved fast. Crates transferred. Labels torn off. Identifying marks removed. Speed was survival. Every minute the original truck remained visible increased risk. Sometimes it was abandoned far from the interception point. Sometimes it was returned empty, as if it had never been touched. The driver was rarely harmed beyond intimidation. Violence created headlines. Headlines created pressure. Pressure disrupted territory. But intimidation left marks invisible to the public. A driver who experienced one hijacking often complied faster the next time. That compliance fed the pipeline. Back at the Bamboo Lounge, phones rang in low voices. Buyers were notified. Fences prepared cash. Electronics might move to storefronts in different boroughs. Clothing might be split across smaller operations. Liquor might be redistributed to bars far from Canarsie. Diversification reduced visibility. The money, once collected, didn't simply land in one pocket. Portions flowed upward. Portions cover bribes. Portions funded future operations. A hijacking wasn't a single event. It was part of a cycle. Young associates saw only the excitement, the chase, the payoff. They didn't always grasp the complexity beneath it. The Bamboo Lounge educated them quickly. If a hijacking went wrong, if police presence spiked, or if a driver resisted unexpectedly, the back room filled with quieter conversation. Mistakes were dissected. Adjustments made. A faulty route was eliminated. A careless associate sidelined. The pipeline evolved constantly. Federal authorities studied patterns. So the crew adjusted patterns. If electronics became too hot, they pivoted to liquor. If a particular stretch of road attracted patrol attention, they shifted miles away. Flexibility kept the machine alive. Imagine trying to steal from a giant corporation repeatedly without triggering alarms. The trick wasn't invisibility. It was plausibility. Losses had to look random, sporadic, within tolerable limits. The Bamboo Lounge's discussions often centered on restraint. Don't get greedy. Don't take every opportunity. Leave space between scores. Greed compresses time, and compressed time leaves fingerprints. As the years progressed, the hijacking pipeline grew more confident. Larger shipments, better coordination, stronger relationships with insiders. That confidence carried risk, because confidence can blur caution. Inside the lounge, debates sometimes flared. One faction pushing for bigger scores, another urging patience. The balance between ambition and survival defined the pipeline's health. The pipeline also relied on silence. Associates were reminded constantly that talking outside approved channels threatened everyone. Stories told at the wrong bar. Boasts whispered to the wrong girlfriend. Small cracks widened under pressure. Fear became part of the infrastructure. Not constant fear, controlled fear. Enough to keep discipline intact. The Bamboo Lounge reinforced that discipline. It wasn't just a meeting spot. It was a classroom. New recruits learned by watching. How to speak. When to listen. How to carry themselves after a job. Celebration was muted. Visibility was minimized. Money moved like current beneath the floorboards. But law enforcement was not blind. Insurance companies noticed repeated losses along certain corridors. Patterns emerged. Investigators mapped thefts, not with neon arrows, but with data points. A cluster here, a spike there. The hijacking pipeline responded by fragmenting. Smaller loads, wider dispersal, less predictable intervals. Yet success is gravity. As profits increased, so did ambition. The Bamboo Lounge began hosting conversations that felt different, heavier, more electric. Not about standard shipments, but about something larger, something audacious. The pipeline that had functioned like a well-tuned engine began considering a turbocharge. Some associates felt exhilarated, others uneasy, because scaling a pipeline doesn't simply increase profit. It increases exposure exponentially. Inside the lounge, maps were drawn not on paper, but in memory. JFK cargo schedules became topics of quiet fascination. Not just trucks leaving, but vaults, storage facilities, cash movements. The ordinary hijacking began to feel almost routine. Routine can breed complacency, and complacency invites disaster. Still, the pipeline continued humming. Trucks intercepted, goods moved, cash counted, portions distributed. From the outside, Canarsie remained calm. Residents saw nothing unusual beyond a bar with regulars. But beneath that calm, a network pulsed with precision. The Bamboo Lounge was not the physical site of every step in the pipeline. It was the brain that connected them, brain and bloodstream. When the brain grows ambitious, the body follows. As whispers of an unprecedented opportunity grew louder inside those walls, the pipeline's existing efficiency became both strength and vulnerability. Because if you can move electronics seamlessly, if you can redirect trucks without chaos, you begin to believe you can move anything, even something no one had dared attempt before. The night the larger plan was first discussed, the Bamboo Lounge felt different. Not louder, quieter. Men leaned in closer. Cigarettes burned down unnoticed. The usual rhythm paused. The pipeline that had served them so well was about to be tested at a scale beyond routine. And once a machine accustomed to precision is pushed to its limits, there's no guarantee it survives intact. The truck on the road that night vanished into the dark like dozens before it. But somewhere inside the Bamboo Lounge, the next move was already forming. And this one would change everything. Chapter 7. Card Games, Loans, and Debt Enforcement. The cards hit the table with a soft slap. Chips slide forward. Someone laughs too loudly, then quickly checks himself. Smoke coils upward, thick and unmoving beneath a yellowed ceiling. The room feels warm, almost comfortable, until you notice the tension in the eyes of the man across from the dealer. He's in deeper than he meant to be, and everyone at the table knows it. The Bamboo Lounge was not just a place where trucks were intercepted and cargo rerouted. It was also a place where money moved in quieter, slower ways. Ways that didn't require engines or highways. Ways that happened in plain sight beneath the hum of conversation and the shuffle of playing cards. The card games were constant. Some nights small, almost casual. Other nights high stakes, drawing players from beyond Canarsie. Men who arrived with envelopes in their pockets and left either lighter or heavier, depending on how luck decided to treat them. Luck, though, was only part of the equation, because the real money in those games didn't always come from the pot in the middle of the table. It came from what happened when the pot wasn't enough. That's where loans enter the picture. Loan sharking in the Bamboo Lounge operated like a tide. Quiet, predictable, always returning. A player who ran out of cash could lean back in his chair and ask for a marker. The money would appear almost instantly, as if summoned from the air. No paperwork, no bank approval, just a nod. But that nod carried weight. Interest in that world accumulated like rust on metal. Slowly at first, almost invisible, but if left unattended, it could corrode everything. A man who borrowed $1,000 might owe more within weeks, depending on the terms. Miss a payment, and the interest compounded. Miss another, and the tone shifted. Conversations became shorter. Eye contact lingered longer. The Bamboo Lounge was both casino and bank. And unlike a legitimate bank, default did not result in a letter. It resulted in a visit. The enforcement side of the operation didn't need spectacle. It needed clarity. When someone fell behind on payments, they were often summoned back to the same tables where they once laughed freely. The card game would pause. Chairs would scrape against the floor. A quieter room in the back might become occupied. Inside that room, voices stayed low. Threats rarely needed to be explicit. A reminder of obligation. A mention of family. A subtle shift in tone. The message landed. Most debtors paid. Because the alternative was humiliation at best and something far worse at worst. In Goodfellas, mob hangouts often feel like social clubs first and criminal enterprises second. The energy leans toward camaraderie. But the Bamboo Lounge's card games were a mechanism, a funnel that pulled cash into the system and bound men to it through obligation. Some players entered willingly. They enjoyed the thrill, the possibility of doubling their money overnight, the ego boost of winning a big hand in front of respected figures. Others stumbled in accidentally. a truck driver invited by a friend, a small-time businessman curious about the action. They didn't always understand that stepping into the game meant stepping into a network, because gambling and lending intertwine seamlessly. A gambler chasing losses becomes a borrower becomes a debtor becomes leverage. The Bamboo Lounge excelled at leverage. If a debtor owned a small business, that business could become useful. If he worked at the airport, information might flow. If he drove routes that intersected with potential hijackings, he might find himself suddenly cooperative. Debt wasn't just about money. It was about access. Henry Hill and others who operated from the lounge understood that card games were recruitment grounds as much as revenue streams. You could assess a man's temperament at a poker table. Does he panic under pressure? Does he cheat? Does he pay his debts without complaint? Character revealed itself in chips and cards. And character determined utility. Loan sharking required precision. Too lenient, and you lost profit. Too aggressive, and you created resentment that could turn into betrayal. The Bamboo Lounge maintained a calibrated pressure, enough to ensure payment, not so much that debtors fled to law enforcement in desperation. Fear had to be balanced with familiarity, because many of the men borrowing money were not strangers. They were locals, neighbors, people who lived within walking distance of the lounge. That proximity made enforcement personal. A debtor might see his lender at the grocery store, at a child's birthday party. The world overlapped, and that overlap reinforced compliance. There were nights when a man would arrive at the Bamboo Lounge already defeated. He'd lost heavily. He'd borrowed beyond his means. His shoulders sagged before he even sat down. In those moments, the lounge shifted from casino to courtroom. He would be told how much he owed, how often he needed to pay, what happened if he failed. Sometimes enforcement was as simple as adjusting payment schedules. Other times it escalated. A shove in the parking lot, a slap that left no visible mark but delivered a clear message. Rarely, something harsher. Violence in the Bamboo Lounge wasn't constant. It was strategic, like punctuation in a sentence, used sparingly but with impact. Associates learned quickly that debt collection required emotional intelligence. You couldn't simply threaten every debtor. Some responded better to pressure, others to negotiation, knowing which kept the pipeline smooth. Because card games and loans fed into the broader operation. Cash from interest payments funded hijackings. Hijackings funded more loans. It was circular, self-sustaining, but it also created vulnerability. The more people indebted to the lounge, the more potential weak links existed. A desperate debtor might consider cooperation with authorities. A humiliated borrower might harbor resentment. The Bamboo Lounge countered this risk through inclusion. Debtors weren't always ostracized. Sometimes they were drawn closer, given small roles in operations, allowed to feel part of the machine rather than crushed beneath it. Inclusion reduces betrayal, yet it never eliminated it entirely. The card games themselves operated under house rules. The house always had an edge, not overtly rigged, just structured in ways that ensured steady profit. The dealer was trusted. The stakes were managed. Outsiders rarely left with consistent winnings. And when someone did win big, the lounge benefited anyway. Because winners played again and again. Gambling is momentum disguised as luck. The Bamboo Lounge harnessed that momentum. Over time, the line between gambler and associate blurred. A man who once came only for cards might find himself asked to drive a vehicle or to store a crate temporarily. Debt creates obligation. Obligation creates participation. Participation deepens entanglement. The lounge thrived on entanglement. But as the hijacking pipeline grew more ambitious, as larger operations loomed on the horizon, the financial ecosystem inside the Bamboo Lounge grew heavier. More money in circulation meant larger loans. Larger loans meant larger enforcement risks. Inside the bar, the card tables remained steady. Chips clicked. Drinks poured. But beneath that surface, stakes were rising. A debtor who once owed a manageable, some might now owe more than he could reasonably repay. Enforcement conversations grew tenser. Backroom meetings lasted longer. Fear edged closer to desperation. Desperation is volatile. There were moments when even seasoned collectors sensed the fragility. A look in a debtor's eyes that suggested panic rather than compliance. Panic can lead to unpredictable decisions. The Bamboo Lounge responded by tightening control. Fewer outsiders invited to high-stakes games. Stricter vetting of new borrowers. Closer monitoring of those already in debt. It was a system adapting under pressure. But pressure continued mounting. As whispers of an unprecedented score circulated, as attention from law enforcement subtly intensified across Brooklyn, the financial web inside the lounge became both asset and liability. Because when a massive operation eventually unfolded, investigators would not only examine trucks and warehouses, they would examine money, loans, payments, patterns. In every card game, every envelope passed across a table, every debtor summoned into a back room would form part of a larger picture. The myth of the Bamboo Lounge paints it as a social playground for mobsters. The reality was a financial engine, a place where cards were more than entertainment, where loans were more than favors, where enforcement was more than muscle. It was a microcosm of power, and like any engine pushed too hard, it was beginning to strain. The cards continued to slap the table. The laughter returned. The smoke thickened. But somewhere beneath that steady rhythm, a crack was forming. And when it finally split open, it wouldn't just expose gamblers and debtors. It would expose the entire machine. Chapter 8. Violence Inside the Walls. The first punch lands without warning. A dull thud against bone, followed by the scrape of a chair skidding across the floor. The jukebox keeps playing for a few seconds longer than it should, as if unsure whether this is part of the rhythm or something breaking it. Then someone reaches over and kills the music. The room goes quiet except for heavy breathing and the faint clink of glass behind the bar. No one calls the police. No one rushes to intervene. Because everyone understands what's happening. The Bamboo Lounge wasn't a slaughterhouse. It wasn't a constant scene of brutality. But it was a place where violence existed like a loaded gun in a drawer. Not always visible, not always used, but always present. In the movies, mob violence is dramatic. It explodes in cinematic bursts. A character insults the wrong person, and chaos erupts with music swelling beneath it. It's shocking, sometimes even darkly entertaining. Inside the real Bamboo Lounge, violence was colder, more deliberate. It didn't arrive because someone lost their temper over a joke. It arrived because something had been decided. The back room of the lounge wasn't large. A table, a few chairs, smoke-stained walls, a door that closed just tightly enough to muffle sound without eliminating it entirely. The men who were called back there understood what it meant. You didn't get summoned casually. Sometimes it was about debt. A gambler who'd fallen too far behind. A borrower who'd started missing payments. The first meeting might be calm, a warning, a recalculation of terms. But if that warning was ignored, tone changed. Violence inside the Bamboo Lounge functioned like punctuation in a sentence. It emphasized, it clarified, it ended debates. A debtor might be grabbed by the collar and pushed into a wall. A fist might land once, twice, not to maim but to send a message. The message wasn't about pain alone. It was about hierarchy. Hierarchy must be visible to survive. If one man failed to pay and faced no consequence, others might test limits. The machine depended on predictability. And predictability sometimes required demonstration. The lounge had its share of demonstrations. Associates who skimmed from a hijacked load faced harsher responses. Skimming wasn't just theft. It was betrayal. It threatened trust. And trust was the foundation of every operation planned within those walls. When word spread that someone had pocketed more than his share, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Conversations hushed. Eyes followed the accused as he entered. He might be told to sit. He might be told nothing at all before being escorted to the back. Inside, voices would stay low. You were trusted. You were given a chance. You put everyone at risk. These phrases didn't need to be shouted. The calm delivery carried more weight than a scream. Sometimes the accused denied it. Sometimes he broke immediately, fear overriding pride. The outcome depended on the severity of the offense and the mood of the men delivering judgment. A beating could be quick and brutal. broken ribs, a split lip, a warning etched into flesh. Other times, punishment meant exile. No more invitations to meetings. No more inclusion in profitable operations. In that world, isolation could hurt more than a punch. Violence inside the Bamboo Lounge wasn't random. It was strategic. If someone from outside the crew caused trouble, a driver who resisted too forcefully during a hijacking, a middleman who tried to renegotiate after goods were delivered, enforcement could escalate beyond the backroom. A visit to their home, a confrontation in a parking lot. But even those moments often trace back to decisions made inside the lounge. The myth of mob life suggests that violence was impulsive, ego-driven. The reality in Canarsie was more controlled. The men who operated there understood that unnecessary bloodshed attracted attention. Headlines, investigations, federal scrutiny. So they calibrated force. The Bamboo Lounge became a place where reputations were forged not just through profit, but through discipline. A man who handled enforcement calmly, without losing control, gained respect. A man who let anger override judgment was seen as liability. That evaluation happened constantly. Young associates who witnessed their first backroom confrontation often carried the memory for years. The sound of a body hitting a wall. The smell of sweat and fear. The way the room felt smaller once the door closed. Some felt exhilarated, others unsettled, but none forgot it. Violence inside those walls also had an emotional toll on the men delivering it. That's a detail rarely explored. The collector who had to break a debtor's nose might tell himself it was business. Necessary. But later, lying in bed, he might replay the moment. The look in the debtor's eyes. The crack of cartilage. Compartmentalization became survival. Inside the lounge, these moments were rarely discussed afterward. Once punishment was delivered, the room reset. The jukebox turned back on. Drinks resumed pouring. The illusion of normalcy restored. That restoration was essential, because the Bamboo Lounge operated on duality. Social hub, on the surface. Enforcement chamber beneath it. There were also moments when violence crossed from controlled to final. Whispers circulated about associates who disappeared after crossing lines too deeply. The lounge might not have been the site of every ultimate act, but it was often the site where such acts were decided. Decisions traveled outward. A man who had become too unstable, too reckless, too talkative. A man whose debts exceeded not just money but trust. Inside the backroom, these discussions were colder than any punch. Violence then shifted from reactive to preemptive. The weight of those decisions hung in the air long after the door reopened. Even the bar's owner felt it. Sonny Bamboo had to manage atmosphere carefully after particularly intense moments. Customers at the front might sense tension without knowing details. He adjusted lighting, music, conversation. He couldn't erase what happened, but he could smooth the edges. The Bamboo Lounge survived because violence was contained. Contained does not mean absent. It means measured. There were nights when arguments erupted between associates themselves. Ego clashes. Disagreements over percentages. A tone misinterpreted. These moments could escalate quickly. In those cases, authority intervened. A single raised hand from someone higher in the hierarchy could silence the room, reminding everyone that personal pride could not override collective interest. Hierarchy absorbed volatility. Without it, the lounge would have imploded. The violence inside those walls served as both deterrent and glue. It reinforced rules. It discouraged deviation. It reminded everyone that the stakes were real. And yet, the more ambitious the operations became, the greater the potential for conflict. As the hijacking pipeline grew more lucrative, envy surfaced. Disputes over shares. Accusations of uneven distribution. The backroom saw more traffic. Pressure accumulated. Federal investigations were expanding across New York. Associates felt the tightening noose. Paranoia intensified, and paranoia can make even minor disputes feel existential. Inside the Bamboo Lounge, conversations began carrying sharper edges. Trust wavered. Alliances shifted. Violence, once used sparingly, threatened to become more frequent. That shift was dangerous, because increased violence doesn't just enforce discipline. It attracts attention, and attention, in that world, was fatal. The myth suggests that mob hangouts were playgrounds of bravado and spontaneous brutality. The reality in Canarsie was a calculated environment where violence was a tool, unsheathed when necessary, hidden when not. But tools were down with use. And as the scale of operations prepared to leap beyond routine hijackings into something unprecedented, the emotional temperature inside the Bamboo Lounge began rising. Fear, greed, ambition, suspicion, all combustible. The walls that once contained controlled discipline were about to witness something far more volatile. Because when stakes multiply, restraint often shrinks. And the next decision made inside that back room would not just leave bruises. It would leave bodies. And once blood flows at that scale, there's no turning back. Chapter 9. Jimmy Burke's shadow over the lounge. The money hits the table in thick, rubber-banded stacks. No one counts it out loud. No one celebrates. The room feels tight, like the air has been compressed. Outside, Canarsie is quiet. Inside, the future is being measured in silence. He doesn't need to raise his voice. He rarely does. When he walks into the Bamboo Lounge, conversations don't stop dramatically. They simply lower. Chairs shift slightly. Eyes follow without staring. The bar's rhythm adjusts itself around him, like water parting around stone. Jimmy Burke was not the owner of the Bamboo Lounge. His name wasn't on the door. He didn't wipe down the bar or manage the jukebox. But his shadow stretched across the room regardless. If the Bamboo Lounge was a nerve center, Burke was a voltage surge. He operated within the structure, within the territory, but his influence felt different, sharper, less patient. Where some men built power through steady administration, Burke built it through audacity. He understood hijacking not just as income, but as expansion, a test of how far the system could stretch before snapping. The Bamboo Lounge had already proven itself efficient at moving electronics, clothing, liquor. Trucks disappeared, goods redistributed, cash circulated. But Burke saw potential beyond routine. When he leaned into conversations at the back tables, it wasn't about small adjustments. It was about scale. The younger associates felt it immediately, a kind of gravitational pull, ambition radiating outward. Working under him meant access to larger opportunities, larger paydays, larger risk. Risk was his language. The lounge became a place where Burke's energy collided with the existing pipeline. He wasn't reckless in the sense of chaos. He was strategic, but his strategy aimed higher. He believed that if a machine functioned well at one level, it could function even better at another. The hijacking system had matured. It was disciplined, coordinated, under control. Burke wanted more. He didn't announce grand plans in cinematic fashion. He planted ideas. What if? What's the biggest shipment you've seen come through? Who has eyes on the cash movements? These weren't shouted declarations. They were quiet probes, testing reactions, measuring appetite. Inside the Bamboo Lounge, the dynamics shifted subtly. Men who once felt comfortable with steady income began imagining windfalls that dwarfed previous scores. The psychology changed. Routine hijackings create stability. Massive operations create mythology. Burke understood mythology. He cultivated loyalty not just through fear or enforcement, but through opportunity. Associates who aligned with him, since they were stepping into something historic. But history has consequences. He moved through the lounge like someone mapping its limits, assessing who could handle pressure, who folded too easily, who talked too much after a drink. Trust became currency. He trusted selectively. The Bamboo Lounge, under his expanding shadow, began hosting conversations that felt heavier than anything before. Electronics and clothing were profitable, but they were also incremental. Burke's imagination reached toward vaults and armored rooms, toward something that would redefine scale. Those early discussions were fragments, half sentences, references to cash storage at the airport, security protocols, shift changes, the kind of details that required insider access and airtight coordination. Henry Hill, who had used the lounge as a base for steady operations, felt the temperature rise. He admired Burke's confidence. Feared it too, because bigger scores meant bigger scrutiny. Burke didn't dismiss that reality. He factored it in. He believed in compartmentalization, tight circles, limited exposure. He believed that if enough pieces moved perfectly, the machine would hold. The bamboo lounge became his staging ground, not because it was glamorous, but because it was controlled territory, protected by hierarchy, shielded by routine, familiar. He used that familiarity to his advantage. Meetings happened at off hours. Conversations layered over card games and drinks. Outsiders saw nothing unusual. Insiders sensed a shift. Burke's presence also carried an undercurrent of volatility. He rewarded loyalty generously. He punished betrayal decisively. Associates understood that crossing him meant more than losing access to future jobs. It meant jeopardizing safety. Inside the lounge, that knowledge created discipline. Men spoke carefully. They aligned publicly. They demonstrated competence. Burke appreciated competence. He wasn't interested in small-time amateurs chasing thrills. He wanted reliability, precision, nerves that didn't crack under interrogation. The bamboo lounge filtered for that. As plans coalesced, the hijacking pipeline that had served them well began integrating new variables. Not just trucks, not just cargo, but cash. Millions in cash. The scale was intoxicating. Inside the back room, maps of airport cargo areas were described verbally. Who had keys? Who had clearance? Which night security was thinner? Burke listened more than he spoke. He asked pointed questions. What if security changes shifts early? What if someone panics? What if law enforcement reacts faster than expected? He anticipated failure modes. That anticipation reassured some associates. It terrified others. Because the bigger the operation, the bigger the fallout if it collapsed. The bamboo lounge felt like a pressure chamber during those weeks. Not loud, not chaotic, just dense, charged. Card games continued. Loans circulated. Enforcement maintained order. But beneath that routine, something massive was taking shape. Burke's shadow lengthened. He wasn't the territorial authority in Canarsie. He operated within that structure. But his personality exerted a gravitational pull that altered the room's atmosphere. Ambition is contagious. So is paranoia. As whispers about an unprecedented score circulated, law enforcement pressure across New York intensified. Not necessarily targeting this plan directly, but patterns were emerging from years of hijackings. Burke sensed it. He didn't retreat. He doubled down on secrecy. Meetings became smaller, circles tighter. The bamboo lounge still functioned as a base, but certain details traveled only through trusted intermediaries. Trust narrowed, and when trust narrows, tension widens. Associates who once felt central began sensing exclusion. That exclusion bred insecurity. Insecurity breeds mistakes. Burke knew that too. He managed personalities carefully, rewarding those who performed, keeping others close enough to feel included, but far enough to limit exposure. The lounge was no longer just coordinating routine hijackings. It was incubating legend. But legends cast long shadows. The night the massive operation finally unfolded, the bamboo lounge felt eerily calm. No champagne, no loud celebration, just a tight gathering of men who understood the scale of what had just happened. Cash. Millions. For a moment, it felt like validation. The machine had worked. Burke's confidence seemed justified. But success at that magnitude does not remain invisible. News broke quickly. Headlines. Shock. Investigators mobilized. Federal agencies activated resources beyond what routine hijackings ever triggered. Inside the bamboo lounge, the mood shifted almost overnight. Relief gave way to calculation. What had been audacious now felt radioactive. Burke's shadow grew darker. He knew that loose ends had to be tied, that anyone who threatened exposure represented existential risk. The same decisiveness that built loyalty now pivoted toward containment. Associates who had participated in the operation sensed the change. Conversations grew guarded. Eyes darted more often. Fear seeped into the edges of the room. The Bamboo Lounge, once a steady nerve center, began absorbing a different energy, suspicion. Because when millions vanish overnight, scrutiny multiplies. And scrutiny requires silence. Burke valued silence above all. Men who celebrated too openly. Men who spent too visibly. Men who talked carelessly. They became liabilities. The shadow he cast over the lounge was no longer just ambition. It was enforcement at its most unforgiving. Discipline tightened. Visits to the back room increased. Associates who once felt invincible now felt exposed. The Bamboo Lounge had facilitated the rise of one of the most audacious operations in organized crime history. Now it had to absorb the fallout. Burke's influence ensured that the machine didn't collapse immediately. He managed fear the same way he managed logistics, decisively. But fear is corrosive. It erodes trust from the inside. And as federal investigations widened and informants became more valuable than ever, the shadow that once inspired ambition began inspiring something else. Dread. Because when a leader becomes both protector and potential executioner, loyalty transforms into survival. Inside the Bamboo Lounge, glasses still clinked, cards still shuffled, but the room no longer felt like opportunity. It felt like a countdown. Jimmy Burke's shadow had elevated the lounge to unprecedented heights. Now it threatened to drag it into darkness. And once darkness takes hold, even the strongest structures begin to crack. Chapter 10. The Lufthansa Heist and the Beginning of the End. The vault door swings open before dawn. Inside, stacks of cash sit bundled in canvas bags, waiting for armored trucks that will never arrive on schedule. Within minutes, millions of dollars vanish into the cold December air. No alarms screaming into the sky. No gunfire echoing across the tarmac. Just efficiency, precision, silence. By sunrise, it is the largest cash robbery in American history. And inside the Bamboo Lounge, the news doesn't explode. It sinks. The Lufthansa heist was not an accident. It was not improvisation. It was the culmination of everything that had been refined inside those Canarsie walls for years. Information gathering, route planning, compartmentalization, trust, discipline, all of it sharpened for one purpose. The scale was staggering. Cash that normally moved quietly through airport vaults now sat in the hands of men who had built their careers intercepting trucks in dimly lit corners of Brooklyn. The hijacking pipeline had expanded beyond cargo, beyond electronics and clothing. It had struck at the heart of cash flow itself. Inside the Bamboo Lounge, the first reactions were measured. There was pride, undeniable pride. Years of preparation had paid off. The machine had worked. Security had been breached without chaos. The plan executed with almost clinical precision. But beneath the pride was something heavier. Awareness. Because this was different. Routine hijackings disappear into insurance reports. Corporations absorb losses. Police file paperwork. This was national news. Millions stolen in a single sweep from an international airport. Federal agencies activated instantly. Task forces assembled. The spotlight intensified beyond anything Canarsie had ever faced. The Bamboo Lounge had always relied on invisibility. The Lufthansa heist shattered it. In the days following the robbery, the atmosphere inside the lounge thickened. Conversations were shorter. Phones rang more frequently. Names were spoken even less than before. Money distribution required care. Millions in cash cannot simply be handed out like card game winnings. It had to be divided, stored, laundered through fences and businesses that could absorb it gradually. Speed now became danger. Spending too fast meant attention. New cars, fur coats, jewelry, the kind of visible upgrades that attract law enforcement scrutiny. Burke understood that. He issued quiet reminders. Keep it low. Keep it slow. No sudden lifestyle changes. But money that large exerts gravitational pull. Some associates couldn't resist. Inside the Bamboo Lounge, whispers began circulating about purchases that felt reckless. A Cadillac bought outright. A lavish party thrown too soon. A woman flashing jewelry that didn't match her prior lifestyle. Each whisper tightened the air, because federal investigators weren't just mapping routes anymore. They were mapping behavior. The Bamboo Lounge had once been a coordination center for theft. Now it became a coordination center for containment. Meetings shifted tone. Instead of planning the next score, discussions focused on minimizing exposure. Who knew what? Who might talk? Who seemed nervous? Paranoia sharpened edges. Burke's shadow, once ambitious and expansive, turned inward. He began assessing not opportunity, but risk. Loose ends became intolerable. Associates, who had once been assets, now felt like variables. And variables in a crisis are threats. Inside the lounge, men who had celebrated quietly days before now avoided prolonged eye contact. They sensed the shift. They felt the recalibration of loyalty. Because massive success doesn't just elevate, it destabilizes. The federal response to the Lufthansa heist was swift and relentless. Surveillance intensified. Informants were cultivated aggressively. Financial trails were examined. Associates with even peripheral involvement felt pressure mounting. The Bamboo Lounge remained outwardly unchanged. Drinks poured. Card games resumed. Sonny maintained the illusion of routine. But the room was no longer a place of steady rhythm. It was a pressure cooker. Burke's decisions in those weeks would define the beginning of the end. He believed in eliminating risk. And risk now wore human faces. One by one, men connected to the heist began disappearing. Some were found shot execution style. Others vanished without bodies. The pattern was unmistakable. Silence was being enforced permanently. Inside the Bamboo Lounge, each disappearance landed like a muted explosion. No one spoke openly about it, but everyone understood. Celebration had turned to survival. Burke rationalized it as necessary. Anyone who might talk under pressure endangered everyone. The federal heat was unprecedented. Sacrifices had to be made, but each act of elimination eroded something fundamental. Trust. Associates who had once felt protected under his leadership now wondered if they were next. Loyalty born of opportunity began morphing into loyalty born of fear. Fear fractures cohesion. The Bamboo Lounge, which had thrived on disciplined collaboration, began hosting quieter, colder meetings. Conversations that once centered on logistics now centered on who could be trusted. Paranoia seeped into every interaction. A laugh that lingered too long. A question asked twice. A glance toward the door when a car passed outside. Everything felt suspicious. Federal investigators were patient. They didn't need immediate arrests. They needed pressure. Time. Mistakes. And mistakes were multiplying. Cash from a heist circulated unevenly. Some participants felt shortchanged. Others worried about uncollected shares. Resentment simmered beneath enforced silence. Inside the lounge, the financial ecosystem that once thrived on predictable flow now felt unstable. Loan sharking operations continued. Card games resumed. But the scale of money from Lufthansa dwarfed everything else. It distorted perspective. What once felt like a significant hijacking now seemed trivial. And that distortion changed behavior. Associates accustomed to incremental risk now faced existential stakes. Henry Hill, watching the spiral from inside the system, felt the walls closing in. He saw how the Bamboo Lounge had shifted from opportunity hub to containment chamber. The same place that once elevated him now felt like quicksand. Federal surveillance intensified around known associates. Wiretaps, informants, undercover operations. The net tightened slowly. Burke's attempts to control the fallout through elimination bought time. But time is finite. The more bodies linked indirectly to the heist appeared, the more investigators focused their lens. The Bamboo Lounge's invisibility had vanished. Even routine gatherings began attracting attention. Unmarked cars parked nearby. Faces lingering too long outside. The sense of being watched crept into every conversation. Sonny Bamboo felt it too. As owner, his name tied directly to the establishment. He had maintained the illusion of normalcy for years. Now that illusion was cracking. The lounge had been a headquarters disguised as a bar. Now it was a bar under scrutiny. The Lufthansa heist, intended as a crowning achievement, became an accelerant. It exposed the scale of the crew's ambition. It forced federal resources into overdrive. It amplified internal paranoia, and it revealed the fragility of even the most disciplined pipeline. Inside the Bamboo Lounge, the jukebox still played. Glasses still clinked, but the energy had shifted permanently. Men no longer saw the room as a launch pad. They saw it as a crossroads. The machine that had functioned with near-clockwork precision for years was grinding under pressure. Each elimination, each rumor, each investigative development chipped away at cohesion. Burke's shadow, once a source of expansion, became a cloud of uncertainty. And as federal cases built quietly in the background, as informants weighed survival against loyalty, the foundation beneath the Bamboo Lounge began to crack. The Lufthansa heist had marked a peak, but peaks are often followed by descents. And inside those Canarsie walls, the realization dawned slowly. The operation that proved they could take millions in a single night had also ensured that nothing would ever feel routine again. The beginning of the end rarely announces itself with sirens. It arrives in silence. And in the Bamboo Lounge, that silence had grown deafening. Chapter 11. Paranoia, Informants, and the Cracks in the Wall. The man sitting at the bar orders the same drink he always does. Same stool. Same nod to the bartender. On the surface, nothing has changed. But tonight he doesn't finish it. His eyes flick to the door every time it opens. He notices things he never used to notice. A car idling too long outside. A stranger who doesn't look lost enough to justify being there. The music feels louder than it should. Paranoia doesn't arrive like a storm. It seeps in like water through a hairline crack. After the Lufthansa heist, the Bamboo Lounge stopped feeling like a headquarters and started feeling like a target. Federal agents weren't kicking down doors. They didn't need to. They were patient. They were methodical. And they understood something the men inside the lounge were only beginning to accept. Pressure changes people. The system had thrived on discipline, on silence, on hierarchy. But massive success had disrupted equilibrium. The more intense the investigation became, the more each associate began calculating his own survival. Inside the Bamboo Lounge, conversation shortened. Jokes carried less warmth. Even the card games felt strained. A laugh that once rang freely now sounded forced. The fear wasn't abstract anymore. It had names. Subpoenas. Surveillance. Wiretaps. Federal investigators built cases slowly, like bricklayers constructing a wall one piece at a time. They didn't need a confession from the top. They needed pressure on the edges. And edges crack first. Associates who once felt insulated began receiving visits. Not dramatic raids. Quiet knocks on doors. Questions asked politely. Offers implied without being fully stated. You don't need to threaten a man if you can show him what he stands to lose. Families became leverage. Children's futures became bargaining chips. The Bamboo Lounge had always depended on silence. But silence becomes fragile when fear replaces loyalty. Jimmy Burke felt it. His decisions after the heist had been ruthless. He believed eliminating potential weak links would strengthen the structure. But every disappearance planted seeds of doubt. If loyalty could be repaid with execution, what protected anyone? Inside the lounge, men avoided discussing the missing openly. But absence speaks louder than words. A regular who once occupied the corner booth no longer showed up. A collector who once handled loan payments vanished from the schedule. Each empty chair felt like an accusation. Paranoia fed on those absences. Henry Hill began noticing changes in himself. He drank more, slept less. He watched for tails when driving. He checked mirrors repeatedly. The same confidence that had once fueled his coordination of hijackings now curdled into anxiety. The Bamboo Lounge no longer felt like a command center. It felt like a room full of potential witnesses. Federal agents understood psychology. They cultivated informants not through brute force, but through isolation. Separate a man from his crew. Amplify his fear. Suggest that others are already cooperating. Create the impression that loyalty is one-sided. It worked. The first cracks appeared quietly. A small-time associate arrested on an unrelated charge suddenly seemed willing to talk. A debtor facing prison for tax issues hinted at knowledge of operations. Informants rarely begin with grand revelations. They start small, confirming patterns, identifying faces. Each confirmation tightened the net. Inside the bamboo lounge, whispers about rats began circulating. The word itself carried venom. Being labeled an informant meant permanent exile at best, death at worst. But fear distorts judgment. Men began suspecting each other without evidence. A glance interpreted as guilt. A nervous habit mistaken for betrayal. Paranoia is contagious. The lounge, once a place of coordinated action, began fragmenting into pockets of suspicion. Burke tried to maintain control. He emphasized loyalty, reminded associates of shared history, of shared risk. But his previous decisions undermined that appeal. If he could eliminate someone for being a potential liability, what stopped him from eliminating someone merely suspected? Trust eroded incrementally. Federal surveillance intensified. Wiretaps captured fragments of conversation. Not full confessions, just enough context to map relationships. Agents parked outside Canarsie bars, watched who entered and left, built timelines, cross-referenced financial activity with known associates. The bamboo lounge's invisibility had evaporated. Sonny Bamboo felt the shift acutely. As owner, he sensed tension in customers who weren't part of the inner circle. Regular patrons noticed unfamiliar faces lingering outside. Business slowed slightly. Not enough to panic. Enough to feel. Inside, meetings became smaller. Conversations moved off-site when possible. The lounge remained symbolic, but reliance on it decreased. That shift signaled vulnerability. When a headquarters becomes unsafe, the structure weakens. Hill found himself increasingly cornered. Arrests in peripheral cases brought him into contact with law enforcement more frequently. Investigators were subtle. They presented evidence strategically, not overwhelming, just enough to make him doubt the protection he believed he had. He knew what happened to suspected informants. He had seen the aftermath of internal purges. Fear of federal prison competed with fear of internal retribution. The bamboo lounge, once a sanctuary, now felt like a place where any conversation could be overheard. Even walls seemed thinner. Associates began limiting time spent there. Quick check-ins instead of long evenings. Reduced card games. Less visible congregation. The social fabric frayed. Meanwhile, federal cases accumulated quietly. Indictments didn't drop immediately. Agents preferred building comprehensive frameworks, connecting hijackings, loan operations, the Lufthansa heist. Each piece interlocked. Inside the lounge, paranoia reached new heights when word spread that someone had been recorded unknowingly. A conversation captured, a detail revealed. Suddenly, even longtime friendships felt unstable. Burke's approach hardened further. He scrutinized associates intensely, questioned minor inconsistencies, pressured loyalty publicly. But public pressure can accelerate private doubt. Men began rehearsing answers in their heads before speaking, avoiding certain topics entirely, reducing exposure by limiting involvement in ongoing operations. The hijacking pipeline slowed, not because opportunity disappeared, because trust did. The bamboo lounge's heartbeat weakened. What had once been a place of opportunity now resembled a waiting room, waiting for subpoenas, for arrests, for betrayal. Henry Hill's internal conflict intensified. The more he sensed instability, the more he contemplated survival strategies. Federal agents offered protection, witness programs, a way out. But that path meant burning every bridge behind him. Inside the lounge, he still nodded at familiar faces, still engaged in cautious conversation. But inside, a calculation had begun. Self-preservation versus loyalty. Loyalty versus freedom. Paranoia warps perception. Every siren outside felt personal. Every unfamiliar car suspect. Sleep became fragmented. Conversations replayed endlessly in the mind. The bamboo lounge's walls, once solid, felt porous. And federal agents didn't need to break them down. They needed to wait. Informants are rarely the most ambitious men. They are often the most frightened. As arrests began targeting peripheral players, The message was clear. No one was beyond reach. Burke sensed it too. His shadow over the lounge grew more oppressive. Associates felt watched not just by federal agents, but by their own leadership. 2 layers of scrutiny. That pressure is unsustainable. Eventually, someone bends. The cracks in the wall widened. Conversations with law enforcement became more detailed. Names surfaced. Timelines confirmed. The Lufthansa heist, once mythic in scale, became a prosecutorial blueprint. Inside the bamboo lounge, the mood shifted from anxiety to inevitability. The machine had been extraordinary, but extraordinary machines still rely on human components. And humans, under enough pressure, fracture. The myth of the bamboo lounge suggests a glamorous underworld immune to consequence. The reality was far more fragile. Paranoia doesn't just follow success. It dismantles it. As federal indictments loomed and informant testimony solidified, the once impenetrable structure built in Canarsie began collapsing from within. The cracks in the wall were no longer hairline. They were fractures. And once fractures spread, even the strongest walls fall. Chapter 12. The Fall of the Bamboo Lounge. The sign still flickers the way it always did. The same uneven glow. The same tired hum against the Brooklyn night. From the outside, nothing looks different. Cars pass. A couple walks by without slowing. The door opens and closes like it has for years. But inside, the air feels hollow. The bamboo lounge had survived whispers. It had survived violence behind closed doors. It had survived the largest cash robbery in American history. For a long time, it felt like the building itself had a kind of immunity, like its walls absorbed pressure and returned to stillness. But buildings don't fall all at once. They weaken first. After the Lufthansa heist, after the disappearances, after the slow drip of indictments and informants, the lounge stopped being a nerve center and started becoming evidence. Federal agents had been patient. They let Paranoia do part of their work. They gathered testimony piece by piece. They mapped connections from hijacked trucks to fences, from fences to loan operations, from loan operations back to meetings inside that modest bar in Canarsie. They didn't need dramatic raids every week. They needed structure. And eventually, they had it. The first real blow didn't come in the form of flashing lights or sirens. It came in the form of paperwork. Indictments filed. Arrest warrants issued. Names printed in black ink. No longer whispered in smoke-filled rooms, but spoken aloud in courtrooms. The bamboo lounge felt the impact immediately. Regulars stopped coming. Not because they suddenly feared the bar itself. Because they feared association. A place that had once offered opportunity now carried liability. The card game shrank. The back room sat empty more often than not. Conversations that once stretched late into the night ended early, clipped and careful. Sonny Bamboo felt it in the cash register, in the slower evenings, in the way longtime patrons avoided eye contact. He had built his role around illusion, maintaining the appearance of an ordinary neighborhood bar. Now that illusion was collapsing under the weight of headlines. Federal agents began appearing more visibly in the area. Not necessarily inside the lounge every night, but close enough to be noticed. A parked car that lingered. A face that returned too frequently. The bamboo lounge was no longer invisible. And once a headquarters loses invisibility, it loses function. Jimmy Burke's control had already been strained by paranoia and internal purges. Now legal consequences began catching up with him and others. Arrests weren't rumors anymore. They were public. Associates who once walked through the lounge's door with quiet confidence now entered under a cloud. Some stopped coming entirely. The hierarchy that had protected the bar's operations for years began fracturing under federal pressure. Territory still mattered, but legal exposure trumped street authority. The old system, built on silence and discipline, found itself vulnerable to testimony and wiretaps. Henry Hill's cooperation with federal authorities accelerated the unraveling. When he stepped into the role of informant, it wasn't just a personal decision. It was a structural collapse. He knew the lounge intimately. He knew its rhythms, its meetings, its players. His testimony didn't just target individuals. It illuminated the ecosystem. 4 federal prosecutors. The Bamboo Lounge transformed from myth to map. Meetings that once felt safe became evidence of conspiracy. Conversations that once passed unnoticed were reconstructed in courtrooms. The back room, once a chamber of quiet enforcement, became a symbol of organized crime's reach into a working-class neighborhood. Inside the lounge, the mood shifted from paranoia to resignation. The machine wasn't just cracking. It was being dismantled. One by one, the pillars that supported the operation were removed. Key players incarcerated. Associates cooperating. Financial networks exposed. Without those pillars, the Bamboo Lounge had no functional purpose beyond serving drinks. And even that felt compromised. Regular customers, the ones who had once provided camouflage, no longer felt comfortable. The bar's reputation had shifted permanently. It was no longer a quiet neighborhood spot. It was a crime landmark. Sonny faced a dilemma that had been years in the making. He had navigated the tightrope between legitimate business and criminal headquarters with skill. But once federal scrutiny fixed on the lounge, that balance was impossible to maintain. Liquor licenses are fragile under investigation. Regulatory agencies take interest. Insurance companies reconsider risk. The external pressures multiplied. Inside the bar, the jukebox still played. The stools still lined the counter. But the energy was gone. A place that once buzzed with calculation now echoed with absence. The fall wasn't cinematic. There were no dramatic final standoffs inside the lounge. No last, defiant meetings with grand speeches. The fall was administrative, legal, inevitable. Court dates replaced backroom negotiations. Sentences replaced enforcement. The Bamboo Lounge became part of testimony transcripts. For the men who had built careers within those walls, the collapse felt surreal. Years of coordination, discipline, risk, reduced to exhibits in court. Jimmy Burke's shadow, once expansive, shrank under incarceration. His ability to manage risk evaporated behind bars. The authority that had shaped the lounge's operations no longer reached its walls. Without that shadow, the room felt smaller. Without the hierarchy intact, the lounge was just wood, glass, and neon. Henry Hill entered witness protection. His path diverged completely from the world he once navigated. His cooperation ensured that the Bamboo Lounge's secrets would not remain confined to Canarsie. They would be retold, publicly, repeatedly. The myth of the glamorous mob hangout grew in popular culture. But the real lounge faced quieter consequences. Financial strain, regulatory pressure, diminished reputation. Over time, the Bamboo Lounge ceased functioning as it once had. Ownership changed. The bar's name eventually faded. The physical space endured, but its identity transformed. The headquarters disguised as a bar was gone. What remained was an address, a memory, a symbol of how proximity to power can feel invincible until it isn't. For Canarsie residents, the change was gradual. The neighborhood continued its routines. Lawns were mowed. Kids played in the street. The spectacle had never been visible in full. But those who had lived inside the Bamboo Lounge's orbit understood the shift. A chapter had closed. The fall of the lounge wasn't just about arrests or convictions. It was about the collapse of a system that relied on precision and silence. Silence had been broken. Precision had been documented. And the machine could not survive exposure. In the end, the Bamboo Lounge didn't go out in flames. It faded. A headquarters that once coordinated millions in stolen goods and cash became an ordinary location again. But the walls, if they could speak, would tell a different story. They would remember the whispered plans, the card games that spiraled into debt, the backroom confrontations. The night the largest cash robbery in history was celebrated in tense silence. And they would remember how quickly power evaporates once trust collapses. The fall of the Bamboo Lounge was not a single moment. It was a process, a slow unraveling triggered by ambition that exceeded invisibility, by violence that bred paranoia, by informants who chose survival, by federal patience that outlasted street discipline. In movies, mob hangouts often close with a bang. In reality, they close with paperwork, with forfeitures, with keys handed over quietly. The Bamboo Lounge began as a modest bar in Canarsie. It evolved into a criminal headquarters, and it ended as a cautionary tale. Because no matter how carefully a machine is built, no matter how disciplined its operators, once the spotlight locks in, shadows disappear. And without shadows, there is nowhere left to hide. Chapter 13. What the movie never showed. The camera in Goodfellas glides smoothly through the Bamboo Lounge. Red light washes over polished tables. Laughter spills easily. The room feels alive in a way that almost invites you in. It feels like a backstage pass to something thrilling. Dangerous, yes, but glamorous. Magnetic. Controlled. But what the camera never shows is the smell. Stale beer soaked into wood. Cigarette smoke layered so thick it felt permanent. The sour tension that lingered after a backroom meeting ended badly. Hollywood doesn't capture the way fear feels in the stomach when the door opens unexpectedly and every head turns at once. The movie gave the Bamboo Lounge an aesthetic. Reality gave it consequences. In the film, it's a gathering place, a social hub, a place where wise guys laugh, joke, and plot in broad strokes. It's a character in the story, but it's stylized, filtered, romanticized. What never shows is how transactional the room truly was. There were no long speeches about loyalty delivered under dramatic lighting. Loyalty inside the real Bamboo Lounge was quieter and more conditional. It was measured in performance, in silence, in percentages delivered on time, fall short, and warmth evaporated instantly. The movie shows camaraderie. It doesn't show the loneliness. Because for every man sitting at those tables, there was a moment when he realized that no one in that room would protect him if protecting him threatened the whole. The Bamboo Lounge in real life was not a fraternity. It was a filter. Hollywood captures the thrill of score, the celebration, the swagger of success, but it rarely lingers on the aftermath. The nights when sleep doesn't come easily. When a man stares at his ceiling replaying every decision he made that day, wondering which one might undo him. Inside the real lounge, those moments were constant. It doesn't show how many men walked into that bar believing they were rising, only to slowly realize they were being tested, assessed, evaluated for usefulness. A card game wasn't just entertainment. It was surveillance. A loan wasn't just financial help. It was a leash. The movie doesn't dwell on the math, the slow accumulation of debt that crushed pride, the way interest mounted silently until a man's options narrowed to compliance or confrontation. It doesn't show the small humiliations. The forced laughter after a warning is delivered. The nod of agreement when a percentage is adjusted downward. The handshake that feels like a surrender. And it doesn't show the wives, the girlfriends, the families who sensed something shifting in the men they lived with but couldn't name it. Because the Bamboo Lounge wasn't just a physical space. It was a psychological one. Men entered it with ambition and left carrying invisible weight. Even the ones who prospered. Even the ones who walked out with envelopes thick enough to change their lives. Money solves some problems. It creates others. Hollywood's version of the Bamboo Lounge rarely captures the paranoia that set in long before federal agents appeared. The glances over shoulders. The subtle change in tone when certain names were mentioned. In the movie, violence arrives with a bang. A shocking moment that advances the plot. In reality, violence was quieter and more destabilizing. It wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was a conversation that ended too softly. Sometimes it was a man who simply didn't return. And no one asked why. The film compresses time. Real life stretched it. Years of gradual entanglement. Of incremental escalation. The Bamboo Lounge didn't become a criminal headquarters overnight. It evolved. Slowly. Organically. Each successful hijacking reinforcing confidence. Each profitable loan tightening bonds. What the movie never shows is the boredom. The long hours waiting for information. The stretches of routine where nothing dramatic happened. Just men sitting, calculating, watching, waiting. Crime at that level is not constant adrenaline. It is patience. And patience can be suffocating. The Bamboo Lounge was not lit for effect. It was dim because dim rooms invite whispers. It was crowded because crowds provide camouflage. It was unremarkable because unremarkable places survive longer. Hollywood needed color and energy. Reality needed cover. The film presents the lounge almost as a stage set. In truth, it was closer to an office. A place where spreadsheets existed in memory rather than on paper. Where percentages were tracked mentally. Where trust was currency more valuable than cash. And when trust cracked, the entire structure trembled. The movie shows Henry Hill narrating with charm, with a sense of inevitability. What it never shows fully is the internal conflict. The nights when he questioned whether proximity to power was worth the cost. The creeping awareness that the same men who embraced him could eliminate him if survival demanded it. It doesn't show the small tremors that preceded collapse. The uneasy silence after the Lufthansa heist. The tension when someone spent too visibly. The way suspicion seeped into every corner. In cinema, tension peaks and resolves within hours. In the Bamboo Lounge, tension lingered for months. It doesn't show the fear that federal investigations planted inside men who once felt untouchable. The slow realization that wiretaps don't announce themselves. That surveillance is invisible until it's presented as evidence. The movie ends with arrests and dramatic consequences. Reality was slower, more procedural. Indictments filed, deals negotiated, cooperation agreements signed. The Bamboo Lounge became less a hangout and more a footnote in legal briefs. And yet, popular culture preserved its myth. Audiences remember the glow. They remember the music. They remember the swagger. They rarely remember the cost. The real Bamboo Lounge was not elegant. It was efficient. It was not glamorous. It was functional. It did not elevate men. It tested them. And most failed the test eventually. What the movie never shows is the erosion. The way ambition turns into paranoia. The way camaraderie morphs into suspicion. The way success breeds the very conditions that guarantee collapse. The Bamboo Lounge was a microcosm of organized crime's core contradiction. Power depends on secrecy. Success destroys secrecy. Hollywood romanticizes the rise. It compresses the fall. But in Canarsie, the fall felt long and inevitable. The walls that once contained whispers became symbols in courtrooms. The back room that once hosted decisions became part of testimony. And the men who once sat confidently at those tables found themselves recounting those nights under oath. The movie needed heroes and villains. Reality offered complexity. Men who were ruthless in business but tender with their children. Men who rationalized theft as survival. Men who believed they were smarter than the system until the system proved otherwise. The Bamboo Lounge was not a playground for cinematic antiheroes. It was a pressure chamber. And pressure eventually exposes fault lines. What the movie never showed is that the most dangerous thing about that bar wasn't the violence or the money. It was the illusion of control. The belief that discipline could outlast scrutiny. That loyalty could withstand fear. That ambition could expand without consequence. The illusion held for years. Until it didn't. And when it broke, it didn't shatter dramatically. It dissolved, leaving behind a building that looked ordinary. A neighborhood that continued unchanged. And a story that Hollywood reshaped into something more palatable. But beneath that reshaping lies the truth. The Bamboo Lounge was never a glamorous refuge. It was a calculated machine disguised as a bar. And machines built on silence inevitably collapse the moment someone decides to speak. Chapter 14. After the raids. What became of the men? The knock comes just before sunrise. Not loud. Not frantic. Controlled. The kind of knock that carries authority without theatrics. A man opens his eyes to the sound and knows instantly that the world he built inside dimly lit rooms is about to be dragged into daylight. Federal agents do not rush. They wait. They gather. They calculate. And when they move with paperwork in hand and names already printed. For years, the Bamboo Lounge had operated as if the outside world could be managed, diverted, misled, outlasted. But after the Lufthansa heist, after the murders, after the informants, the legal tide finally crested. The raids were not cinematic explosions. They were methodical. Doors open with warrants. Files seized. Conversations recorded. Faces photographed, not for street reputation, but for court evidence. Inside those early morning moments, bravado evaporated. Men who once commanded rooms found themselves standing in handcuffs in their own kitchens. The collapse was not sudden, but it felt sudden to them. Jimmy Burke's fall did not come in a blaze of glory. It came through cases layered one atop another. Charges tied not just to Lufthansa, but to narcotics and racketeering. The web that federal prosecutors built extended beyond a single robbery. Burke, who once controlled outcomes inside the bamboo lounge with quiet authority, now sat in rooms where he controlled nothing. Courtrooms replaced backrooms. Judges replaced enforcers. He had thrived on calculated risk. Now risk belonged to others, prosecutors, witnesses, juries. He did not cooperate. He did not confess in dramatic fashion. He maintained silence. But silence, in the face of overwhelming evidence, did not shield him. Years accumulated behind bars. The shadow he once cast over Canarsie shrank to a prison yard. Henry Hill's trajectory diverged sharply. Where others clung to loyalty, he chose survival. His cooperation with federal authorities dismantled not just individuals, but structures. He testified. He narrated details that once lived only in whispered conversations. He described the bamboo lounge's role in operations, the hierarchy, the violence. His decision ensured protection for himself and his family. But protection came at a cost. Witness protection is not a glamorous escape. It is exile, new names, new towns, constant movement, the loss of identity in exchange for safety. Hill traded one prison for another. He survived, but survival is not the same as triumph. For Sonny Bamboo, the fall was quieter but no less personal. As owner, he had balanced legitimacy and complicity for years. When the raids intensified and indictments mounted, his position became untenable. Regulatory agencies scrutinized the business. Associations that once felt manageable became liabilities. The bar that had functioned as a headquarters lost its function entirely. He was left holding keys to a place that no longer served its original purpose. The bamboo lounge became a shell. Other associates fared worse. Some received long sentences tied to racketeering and related charges. Others found themselves implicated through testimony that had once seemed unimaginable. A few who survived the internal purges only to face federal charges likely wondered if loyalty had been worth it. The disappearances that followed Lufthansa haunted the legal proceedings. Murders linked indirectly to the Heist complicated cases. Even when charges didn't stick, reputations were sealed. The system had once depended on invisibility. Now everything was visible. Court transcripts preserved conversations that once evaporated in smoke-filled rooms. Prosecutors pieced together timelines that the men themselves had forgotten. And families, wives, children, siblings, were pulled into the consequences. The myth suggests mob life ends in either wealth or dramatic death. Reality often ends in fluorescent-lit courtrooms and decades-long sentences. The bamboo lounge's alumni dispersed, some behind bars, some under new identities, some fading into obscurity. A few died years later, not in shootouts, but in hospital beds. The machine that once seemed unstoppable had been dismantled by patience and pressure. For federal investigators, the bamboo lounge became a case study, a demonstration of how organized crime hubs operate in plain sight, how neighborhood establishments can serve as nerve centers, how ambition ultimately creates exposure. The raids did not erase Canarsie. They erased illusion. The neighborhood continued functioning. New businesses opened. New families moved in. The space once occupied by the lounge changed hands over time. But for those who knew what it had been, the address carried weight. It had been a headquarters disguised as a bar. It had coordinated millions in stolen goods. It had shaped careers, and it had destroyed them. The men who once sat confidently at its tables found themselves reduced to file numbers. Their names recited not in whispers, but in indictments. Burke's authority had depended on fear and loyalty. Behind bars, those currencies lost value. Hill's survival depended on betrayal. Outside the life he once glorified, he grappled with consequences that extended beyond legal immunity. The Bamboo Lounge itself faded from active relevance, but its legacy lingered in testimony and popular culture. Movies would reshape the narrative. Books would recount versions of it. But for the men who lived it, the ending was not cinematic. It was administrative, a slow dismantling, one arrest at a time, one conviction at a time, one cooperation agreement at a time. What became of the men was not a single shared fate. It was fragmentation. Some aged in prison. Some adjusted uneasily to anonymity. Some died with stories only partially told. The lounge had once functioned as their shared center. Without it, without the hierarchy that bound them, they were individuals again, vulnerable, exposed. The myth of the Bamboo Lounge suggests permanence. But permanence is an illusion in organized crime. Territory shifts, leadership changes, loyalty fractures, and eventually, the past becomes evidence. The raids did not need drama. They needed documentation. And documentation won. As the years passed, the names associated with the Bamboo Lounge became chapters in larger crime histories. The men themselves aged. Some expressed regret. Others maintained defiance. But none could restore the world that once existed behind those dim lights. After the raids, the Bamboo Lounge was no longer a headquarters. It was a memory of ambition that outran caution, of discipline that fractured under fear, of loyalty that could not withstand survival instinct, and of men who believed they controlled the room until the room was taken from them. The fall was not marked by a single moment. It was marked by accumulation. Accumulated evidence, accumulated paranoia, accumulated consequence. And when consequence finally arrived, it did not knock loudly. It knocked once, and it did not leave. Chapter 15. The legacy of a bar that was never just a bar. The door closes for the last time, without ceremony. No flashing lights. No dramatic farewell. Just a quiet click of metal against metal, the sound swallowed by the Brooklyn night. The neon sign that once flickered above Rockaway Parkway eventually goes dark. Cars keep passing. Neighbors keep walking. The world does not pause. But something has ended. The Bamboo Lounge was never just a bar. It was never just a place to drink, to laugh, to pass time. It was a machine disguised as wooden glass. A headquarters hidden in plain sight. A room where ambition was nurtured, tested, and ultimately destroyed. And like all machines built on secrecy, its true legacy is not in what it looked like, but in what it did. Years after the arrests, after the trials, after the headlines faded, the myth began to grow. Movies told one version. Books told another. Names became characters. The Bamboo Lounge transformed into a symbol. For some, it became a romantic artifact of a bygone era, the golden age of hijackings and underworld order. For others, it became proof of how deeply organized crime embedded itself into ordinary neighborhoods. But myth is cleaner than memory. The real legacy is more complicated. It's found in the men who walked through those doors believing they were building something permanent. They thought the system was stable, disciplined, insulated from collapse. They believed territory would protect them, that hierarchy would shield them, that silence would save them. They were wrong. The Bamboo Lounge proved a truth that organized crime repeats across generations. Success plants the seeds of exposure. The better the machine runs, the louder it hums. The louder it hums, the easier it is to trace. What made the Bamboo Lounge powerful was not violence alone, not hijackings alone, not loans or card games, or even the Lufthansa heist. It was coordination. Coordination built on trust. And trust, once fractured, cannot be repaired. The lounge functioned as connective tissue. It linked truck drivers to fences, debtors to collectors, associates to captains, ambition to opportunity. It made crime feel structured, professional, almost corporate in its efficiency. But corporate systems rely on compliance. And compliance in organized crime depends on fear and loyalty balanced precisely. Too much fear and loyalty collapses. Too little fear and discipline erodes. After Lufthansa, that balance shattered. The legacy of the Bamboo Lounge is not just in the millions stolen or the indictments filed. It is in the demonstration that even the most disciplined underworld hub can be dismantled by patience. Federal agents did not overpower the lounge with brute force. They outlasted it. They understood something the men inside the lounge underestimated. Time is the ultimate pressure. Given enough of it, cracks widen. Given enough of it, someone talks. The Bamboo Lounge's story also left a mark on Canarsie. For residents who lived nearby, the revelation that such operations thrived within walking distance was unsettling. The bar that seemed ordinary had been orchestrating crimes of national significance. The lesson lingered long after the neon faded. Organized crime does not always hide in shadows. Sometimes it hides in familiarity. The lounge's legacy rippled outward into popular culture. It became part of the narrative that reshaped public perception of the American Mafia. No longer faceless syndicates operating in distant cities, but localized networks embedded in neighborhoods. Bars, garages, warehouses, ordinary spaces carrying extraordinary secrets. But the deeper legacy lies in the individuals. Jimmy Burke's name became synonymous with audacity and ruthlessness. Yet his ending was not cinematic. It was confined. Years behind bars. Authority reduced to memory. Henry Hill became the narrator of his own downfall. His survival ensured that the Bamboo Lounge would never remain a mystery. But survival required surrendering the world that once defined him. Sonny Bamboo faded into history, remembered primarily as the man whose bar became a headquarters. The lounge outlived their power, but not their decisions. Every backroom conversation left a trace. Every loan extended created obligation. Every act of enforcement deepened the culture of fear. The bar did not cause those choices. It enabled them. And that is its legacy. The Bamboo Lounge demonstrates how environment shapes behavior. Place matters. When men gather repeatedly in the same room to plan, to enforce, to celebrate, the room absorbs identity. It becomes more than location. It becomes ecosystem. Remove the ecosystem, and the individuals scatter. But the memory remains. Today, the address that once housed the Bamboo Lounge does not command the same tension. New businesses rise. New signs hang. The hum of Rockaway Parkway continues. Yet the story lingers beneath the surface. Because the Bamboo Lounge stands as proof that power built quietly can collapse just as quietly. No final shootout. No dramatic inferno. Just paperwork. Testimony. Time. And doors that close one evening and never reopen under the same name. The movie version gave audiences a stylized glimpse of mob life. The real Bamboo Lounge offered a far more sobering lesson. Crime can be organized. It can be efficient. It can be disciplined. But it cannot outrun consequence indefinitely. The lounge's legacy is etched into the broader narrative of American organized crime. It marked a turning point where ambition exceeded invisibility, where internal paranoia accelerated collapse, where federal patience proved more powerful than street authority. It also serves as a reminder that myth and reality rarely align. Hollywood gave the Bamboo Lounge mood lighting and music. Reality gave it ledgers, indictments, and graves. For every young associate who once walked through its doors with stars in his eyes, there is a lesson embedded in its fall. Proximity to power feels intoxicating. But proximity to power also means proximity to downfall. The Bamboo Lounge was never just a bar. It was a crossroads. Careers began there. Reputations were built there. Trust was tested there. And ultimately, futures unraveled there. Its legacy is not glory. It is caution. Because behind every unassuming storefront could exist a machine humming quietly, fueled by ambition and silence. And every machine, no matter how carefully constructed, contains within it the potential for collapse. The door closed. The neon faded. But the story endures, not as a celebration of what was achieved, but as a warning of what was lost. The Bamboo Lounge did not fall because it lacked intelligence or discipline. It fell because ambition multiplied faster than secrecy. And once secrecy vanished, the room that once controlled so much became just another address on a map. A reminder that no headquarters stays hidden forever.